So hi everyone, as you're joining, John Whitmer here. Nice to see everyone, see friends and colleagues. If your name says, just as echoed in the chat, thanks for joining today. If your name says Leanne Pereira and that's not who you really are, our link is making people say that. Hit the 3 dots next to your name and you can change your name to your real name or a pseudonym should you choose to appear under a pseudonym today. Uh-oh. It looks like people can't actually do that. They can't see the 3 dots next to their name. Upper right-hand corner, not yet. It disappeared when it became a webinar. Uh-oh.
Oh, well, in that case, we will not know who are attending.
All right.
I think the panelists, though, can all change their name. So if you have those 3 dots, please, and you are called Leanne Pereira, please do change your name. That's the case. Seems like we have some people join as panelists who I don't recognize as being on the panel. So don't worry, you might be demoted to participant at some point.
This to me. So maybe we'll begin. My Bay Area Learning Analytics Network is a volunteer-run association that's grateful for this webinar technology that we're here learning. So hope you'll bear with us. We do have a number of people who are moderators, who are panelists. So including people on this first session.
Right, so we've got some people that are attendees that need to be promoted to panelists, but they're all listed as Leanne Pereira, so I can't tell who needs to be promoted. I could promote everyone to panelists and everyone could change their name, and then I could send everyone back to attendees that's not a panelist. That's the only thing I can think of besides trying to regenerate the link.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
All right, hold still, everybody. I'm going to try to promote all of you to panelists. You can then in yourself.
Maybe can the panelists just send a message to all panelists that you are a panelist, and we will. Oh, I see. But then you can't click on them. Is that the problem?
No, they're all named Leanne. I can't.
Right.
25 Leanne say I'm a panelist.
Right. That makes sense.
I'll rename everyone to numbers, and if your number corresponds to
being a panelist, then send us a message. And you can try rejoining with this link here, which is a generic link. Of course, Google Calendar, I did copy. Let me do that one more time. Here we go. This is a generic link that should allow you to join with your regular name. So if you are a panelist, please be sure to join that generic link that should set your regular name so we can identify you.
Okay, I'll remind people as they join to do that. I would like to ask everyone that is not speaking at the moment, but who is a panelist, can you please turn off your camera? Thank you. Awesome. Okay. So it should just be me at this point. Great. So welcome everyone to this special Baylan event. For those of you who haven't joined us before, welcome to the community. A little bit of history about how Baylan came to be. At the 2016 Learning Analytics and Knowledge Conference in Edinburgh, I was there together with Britta, and we looked around and we saw a lot of people from the Bay Area in Edinburgh. And that's when the idea came to be that, you know, why don't we have a meeting closer to home with all the people in the Bay Area that are doing things around learning analytics. So this is the 5th event. Unfortunately, it's not a big event and an in-person conference as we had planned. But yeah, we've had 5 events so far. And in that time, our community has grown from mainly academics that Ritter I knew to a much broader community with people from computer science, from education, from educational technology companies. And I think after today, also some educators that are coming together to talk about how learning analytics can help education. And I really enjoy the diversity in our community with people from so many different backgrounds that are excited about analytics and technology, but also want to make sure that they're doing the right thing and that they're actually helping students learn. If you are not on our mailing list yet, but you want to be, if you go to www.baylan.org, there's a sign up for our mailing list button. And in that way, you can be kept up to date on what we are doing. Today's meeting, like I said, is a special one. Once we realized that we were not able to hold an in-person meeting, we convened with all the original session chairs and we were like, what are we going to do? Do we want to have the meeting online? Do we want to do something else? And very soon from those session chairs came the idea of holding a special session around, you know, what is keeping us from having this online meeting, namely the pandemic that we're in with COVID-19, because we thought it would be super relevant for all the people in our community. Just talk about, you know, what is that doing for the students that are learning in this time. And so John has agreed to host us today, and he's done a fantastic job lining up speakers and lining up panels in a great way for us. So without further ado, I would like to hand over this meeting to John, and he will lead you through it in a very expert fashion, I'm sure. John?
All right. I'm sorry about the technical issues. That's one thing. Here, I'm going to enable my video. So thank you very much for the kind introduction. So I have resent the correct link to all the panelists. I think with this, I think we've got a little bit of information here on the screen. Thank you, everyone. I am Chief Analytics Officer for a startup called Chi-Square Labs, and I'm happy to introduce you to today's session. I think we had a few comments from our sponsors. I think we've all gotten a little bit off our game here. We'll get back on it with some of the technical issues related to the webinar. Apologies for that. Nothing like a live event to make that happen. So I'm going to hit, I think here we wanted to go to, I'm getting my slides advanced for me. Is someone else doing that? This is really exciting. All right, let's try that again. So I think we had Josine. Zach, would you like to, Zach, the Berkeley Graduate School of Education is sponsoring this virtual event with our webinar and as well as their time. Zach, do you want to say a few words?
Sure. Hello, I'm Zach Pardos. I'm an associate professor at the Graduate School of Education at UC Berkeley and a co-organizer of this event. I've given some research talks at Baylan before and hope to again, but today I'm representing the Education School, and the event is sponsored by the Education School's new certificate, professional certificate in teaching and learning in digital spaces. This is a program I'm excited about. It's a 4-course program, which I refer to as the non-crash course in learning to teach online with equitable and inclusive teaching practices. Can be completed in 12 months, and we're launching it in fall. So please do check it out. Thank you.
Great. And we also have a co-sponsor with Quizlet. Do we have Shane Mooney on the line?
Yeah, hi. Hi, I'm Shane Mooney from the Growing Data Science team at Quizlet. This is Quizlet's 3rd year attending Baylan, and we're proud to be a sponsor this year. To tell you a little bit about Quizlet, we're a learning platform that helps students practice and master whatever they're learning. We offer a variety of study activities and games to help students prepare for exams and assessments. And each month we serve over 50 million users across the world, and we're used by a majority of high school and college students in the US. One of the great things about Quizlet is its flexibility. We have web and mobile apps. We're localized into many of the world's top languages. We work well across many subjects, including languages, arts and sciences, and various professional certifications. Really, any study material that can be expressed as either a flashcard or a multiple choice question can be pretty effectively studied on Quizlet. Students and teachers can create their own content or find material to study in our library of over 400 million study sets. And then we use machine learning and learning science principles to help students study that material in an optimal way. So thanks for attending, everyone. Looking forward to the great talks and presentations today.
Great. Thank you very much, Shane, and thank you for your sponsorship. So I just wanted to say a few words about kind of some of the orientation and thinking behind these sessions and what you're likely to see today. So kind of here on the left-hand side, as we've all known and experienced, that we've seen huge closures with the pandemic that we've all been experiencing. One of the many impacts, in addition to health, was impacts on the availability of students to access the conventional and unconventional areas where they learned. So this map on the left is a global map from Wikimedia showing how school closures happened across the globe. And I think, did I put the accent? This is as of June. I've got something on my, we practiced and rehearsed, and yet technology still gets in the way. Some of these issues as of June, that we've had these closures throughout, forcing students as well as their caretakers to think of alternative ways that they can get education and continue learning of students and providing education. And so as people working in learning analytics, many of us have access to that data, looking at how people use these systems. And I think it gives us an affordance so that we can really have a deeper understanding than might otherwise be possible through the conventional media. And we wanted to put together a series of sessions in the next 2 panels that you'll see both in K-12 will begin, as well as in higher education, to think about what has happened or what hasn't happened that was anticipated. We have people who are leaders from analytics areas, as well as educational institutions, and having them speak about their own experiences. And again, as a work in progress, is something that we are beginning to understand, to think about what we've seen so far, what we're likely to see in the future, and hopefully give everyone who is participating have an opportunity for you to give your input and your thoughts, as well as something to kind of take away that might inform the way that you're able to work and serve students through the platforms you're providing and services you're providing, or educational institutions, based on some of that understanding and knowledge. And so very much, this is something that I'm really grateful to the people who are participating today, coming in an area that's still a bit messy, our understanding and what we've done. And so hopefully that's the nature of the conversation today, is to talk about some kind of preliminary results we've seen from what's been called the Great Emergency Onlining. All right, I'm going to go to the next session here. So here's the agenda for today and what we have for kind of panelists. You'll see kind of this quick kickoff and introduction, then go to a series of presentations of the people you see in the upper right here, and then the panelists that we've got as well. We'll have a panel of most of the people giving presentations and a few others as well to have a conversation and discussion around this. We'll take a slight break, a short break, and then go into a similar structure for higher ed, talk about some presentations and experience and research conducted in higher ed around the same pandemic time this spring, and then have a panel discussion as well. And we've got a little bit of flexible time at the end, and we'll have periods for Q&A, just to say, well, we're going to save Q&A toward the end of each of the segments. So at the end of the presentations, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end of the panel, and you get the pattern there going on to presentations and panel. So thank you very much. We're really grateful to everyone for taking your time out to attend today, and hopefully this will be useful to you. All right, and so I've got two monitors and a whole bunch of stuff going on here. So I think we will begin, and I'm going to cross my fingers. We'll begin with Libby Kocha from the Khan Academy. Libby, are you ready to give your presentation? Libby, if she doesn't have speak access. It looks like Libby is a Leanne.
I can message her. Please join.
She said that she doesn't have, she'll have to get promoted. It looks like Libby was on her personal account. Should we switch? Yeah.
Maybe we should switch Jamie and Libby if Jamie's ready to move while we try to get Libby into the speaking access.
I'm happy to go ahead.
And while we're doing this, Libby, can you please raise your hand? That is a different way that I can identify you and promote you.
And we'll actually know which Libby it is.
Yes, will the real Libby please
Libby,
stand up?
please stand up. That's right. Thanks everyone for your patience.
But yeah, let's go to the second speaker, and I'll text with Libby here.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me make sure I'm sharing the correct one. All right. Is everyone looking at taking the blended learning classroom online?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, hi, my name is Jamie Studwell. I manage the product research and analytics team for Rosetta Stone's K-12 education division. We're also known as Lexia Learning. First, for any of you who are not familiar with Lexia Learning, we've been around for about 35 years, serving students through a portfolio of literacy programs. We joined the Rosetta Stone family to become their K-12 education division a few years ago, and are now used by over 4 million students around the world every year. If you've been reading the headlines lately, you'll know that the current moment is talked of as simultaneously the best and the worst time for learning technologies. EdTech is either the savior of a generation or a colossal failure, sometimes in the same news outlet, in this case, both from Forbes, both on the same day. Unsurprisingly, the story is a little bit more nuanced than that. And in the next couple of minutes, I want to share with you what we've learned so far about what's been happening for our educators and students as they attempt to take their blended learning classrooms online, mostly for the first time. There are two things I think that you need to know to understand this data about Lexia. The first is that Lexia's programs are based on an adaptive blended learning model, meaning that they combine online learning with traditional place-based classroom methods into an integrated, personalized experience. Lexia's programs have 3 components: the online student programs themselves, a data portal where educators can monitor students' progress and their performance, see what they're doing, and a bank of instructional resources that help educators act on that data to provide specific instruction, practice, and extension activities for each student's needs. The second important thing for you to know is that because these are blended learning programs, our programs are primarily used in a school setting as a supplement to their English language arts curriculum. The rest of the presentation will be based on 2 data streams, log file information from around 2.5 million students and about 240,000 educators who used our programs between January 6th and May 31st this year. And then I've also coupled that with a bunch of survey data from about 1,700 educators that we surveyed in May. And I've pulled a couple of little things from a survey that just closed like 3 days ago of another 2,000 educators. I'm going to focus on our sites in the United States just because we have the best handle on the exact timing of the school closures here, but we do work all over the world. So the headline is that the pandemic disruption was in fact very disruptive. I jokingly refer to this graph as the rapture, but it's because we found that the school closures caused many students to either stumble for a little bit, use more sporadically across the closure period, or even disappear altogether. Core 5 is our reading program for students in pre-K to 5th grade. And as you can see in this graph, it's active students each week. And we had a pretty consistent number of students using Core 5 in the beginning of the year, the part with the white background. Then the week of March 15th, a sudden drop to just 43% of what it had been the week of March 1st. It did recover over the subsequent weeks, but that recovery took a number of weeks and it only ever got back up to 74% of normal, and that was around the middle to end of April. You'll also notice in this that we saw a very atypical surge of new students who were created in our system. Normally we see very few students created this late in the year, but there were a lot of new students created and started using Core 5 during the closures. Without them, the recovery would have been even smaller if you look at just the blue part of the graph. In fact, when we looked at a cohort of students who had used the program just pre-pandemic, so we looked at the students who had used the week of March 1st, we found that only 70% of them had any logins during April and May, so the real school closure period. 30% of them had disappeared entirely. For context, if you looked at that same cohort the previous school year, only 5% would have disappeared. So that's the 5% that disappeared due to kind of natural causes, we could say. So did every district lose 30% of their students? No. The closures had unequal impacts across districts, but a majority were negatively impacted. In the bar graph on the left, we measured each customer's change in their weekly active students and found that 2/3 of them experienced a decrease or even a heavy decrease, the yellow bars, heavy decrease being more than 70% of their students disappeared. The other 1/3 of customers, the bars in green, were able to maintain similar numbers of active students or even expand their user base during the pandemic. As you can see in the map on the right, the impacts varied by state. It shows the percent of customers in each state that experienced a decrease in usage. Red bubbles indicating states where a majority of customers had their implementations heavily disrupted by the school closures, and green bubbles indicating states where most districts managed to maintain their implementations despite the sudden transition. Now, unfortunately, of course, the question is going to be, we don't have demographic data on most of the students that use our programs for privacy reasons, but we're working to collect that data now. I actually have about 35,000 data points that I've just gotten in. Really excited about that. I don't want to speculate about what we're going to find, but I will say that there are a few things we're going to be looking at as potential explanations for these disparities, specifically state policy contexts, school funding, family socioeconomic status, urbanicity, and district size. We do know, however, that there was a bigger decline and less recovery amongst our middle and high school students. Power Up is our literacy program for students in 6th grade and up. And when we traced the March 1st cohort of students, we found that half of them disappeared and never came back. You might remember that stat was 30% for our elementary program. Our survey data from educators is helping us to understand why some of these students stop using. First off, district level decision making. Usage of learning programs like ours, and in fact, instruction in general in many cases, was put on hold as districts tried to navigate the complexities of, device loaner programs, union contracts, equity issues for students with special needs, myriad other logistical challenges. I won't read the whole quote here, but this is from one of our teachers who said that their district, which is a large district in a prominent area of the country, was closed starting March 13th and only began to allow teachers to teach new material through programs like Lexia on May 4th. Another major reason that students stopped using Lexia was because they simply didn't have access to the right technology at home. Only 54% of educators felt that their students had access to the digital tools that they need, having either poor or limited internet connections at home, not having enough devices at home, or having devices but not the ones that were compatible with all of the learning programs that they needed to use. This is unquestionably an equity issue, and educators' survey responses like this quote at the bottom here showed that these inequities exist not just from school to school, but even between students within the same class, which is why we're so interested in looking, we want to look at urbanicity and school funding in kind of the school's context, but also household funding, because that is likely to be a factor. But even having a device doesn't really guarantee that you're ready to learn right now. Many of our students who had access weren't engaging with remote learning opportunities at all. Not just our program, we heard across the board. Educators explained that this was, it's a perfect storm for many families. Anyone who has children knows all about this. But then for teachers as well, being distant from their students with sometimes poor communication systems, it made it a really challenging environment for teachers to try and motivate their students to do online work. All their old tricks didn't work there. If you'll recall a couple slides ago, we did see a bigger decline and less recovery amongst those middle and high school students with their high degree of autonomy and their general moodiness at that age. It may have been that they were just harder for educators to engage than the younger students. So, if I've made you very sad at the moment, many students did struggle to get onto learning programs during this first period of emergency remote learning. But on the flip side, it's almost a tale of two pandemics, because we've also seen many students and many educators engaging with our programs more than ever before. For them, it sounds like learning programs like ours have really been a lifeline in this crisis. While we've seen student activity drop, the number of students drop, we've actually seen educator activity rise to record levels for us. MyLexia is our educator data portal, and prior to the pandemic, we had around 70 to 80,000 educators who were logging in each week. We saw an almost immediate surge in activity starting the week of March 16th that just kept going as people got more and more engaged. And by late April, we were seeing over 100,000 educators every week logging in. And we found when we looked at it that they were logging in more times every week than they had been pre-pandemic. Educator survey responses showed that the data in the data portal was providing really valuable visibility into what was going on at home for their students. For many educators, I feel like remote learning was like putting on a blindfold. You can't directly observe students in your classroom. You have no progress monitoring or assessment data because all the testing was canceled this spring. And for many of them, the poor communication systems made it hard for them to even regularly check in with their students. So the data hasn't changed, but the need for it really has. A majority of educators that we surveyed said that Lexia was helping them monitor student learning, that it was helping them monitor student engagement. And as the quote on the bottom shows, which kind of just pulls on my heartstrings, it was a way to just know that their students were safe and that they were doing something. I mentioned earlier that offline instructional materials are kind of the third component of our blended learning model. Well, despite the fact that they were accessing the data more, we saw a pretty large drop in how often the educators are viewing those offline materials. In our survey, only 35% of them said that they were using them during the school closures. And we, in this kind of like follow-up survey, we asked a bunch of educators, and they said 50% of them said that they were rarely or never able to intervene one-on-one with struggling students when they needed it. So this was a huge challenge. Stepping back to kind of those three components, if students have the access that they need, it's relatively easy to assign them work in the online program. It's easy to access the data to monitor their learning in the educator portal, but it's really hard to take those traditionally in-person components of your work as a teacher and try to translate them suddenly into this remote learning environment. So back to the students. The funny thing is we had fewer of them, but their engagement also went up during the closures. While the number of students logging in was down, the time they spent every week was up on average by 34% for elementary students and 25% for the middle and high school students. As you can see in the table on the right, this was driven in particular by increases in usage by pre-K to second grade students and by high schoolers. We found this really heartening to us, that if we could get students the access that they needed, a lot of them were really thriving in this environment. So the last thing I have for you are a few really preliminary results that we're still investigating, but that I thought it would be interesting to share with you guys in case they inspire any of your own investigations. A few trends. We're seeing that students who used both before and during the pandemic, they're much less consistent in their usage during the closures. They're more often missing an entire week, and their usage time is more variable week to week. I think teachers are going to be unsurprised by that. It goes very well with the rest of this, but it's interesting to see that even the students that are continuing, they're much more variable. Secondly, it does look like students might be moving through our program more quickly in this context. Many of us worried that without a teacher present, students would be more distracted, or they might struggle more, they weren't being intervened with to get them unstuck, and therefore they might go slower. Instead, we've actually seen similar rates of progress for continuing students, and that new students, the ones who are joining the programs and have only used it in this environment, they're actually moving through the content faster than typical. Whether that speed is a good thing is another big question that we have, and one that we're looking to investigate. Finally, we have some very preliminary evidence that students are actually struggling less in our programs during remote learning. Are they being helped? Are they more focused? There are some positive reasons why that might be happening, and some concerning ones. A lot of teachers are concerned that people are helping them, and that therefore they can't get accurate data on how their students are performing. We have a lot of questions here and are excited to keep digging in. That's all I have for you today. Thanks for listening.
Great. Thank you very much, Jamie, for that. That was a really interesting presentation, and I really appreciate the mention of data, the way that you're kind of seeing the data and those differences and disaggregating that a bit. We are starting to run a little bit behind time, especially I think with some of our earlier technical issues. So I'm going to hand it straight over to Libby. Can you share your screen, and can the real Libby please stand up there in Maui? Fantastic. All right.
Yeah.
We can hear you just great.
Great. All right. I'm gonna share my screen. So I've stolen my partner's computer to get back online. So bear with me as I get used to the backwards format here.
It looks great. Yeah, we can see it just fine. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 second. All right. Hello, y'all. My name is Libby. I'm on the analytics team at Khan Academy. First off, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to share and learn with you all today. I'll start by saying Khan Academy is just starting to scratch the surface in understanding what school closures and the pandemic mean for online education and learning outcomes. So today I'll just be sharing the changes we've observed in usage since March. And I actually think we can really learn a lot by seeing where we've grown and where we are not growing to understand how we can better support students through this next uncertain school year. First, for those of you that don't know much about Khan Academy, we are a nonprofit. Our mission is to provide a free world-class education for anyone, anywhere. We're a global product. We're in 240 countries and translated into 40+ languages. We provide free online content in the form of videos, articles, exercises, a test prep product, and a growing mastery framework, as well as tools for teachers and parents. The slide is actually a little outdated. This is from the beginning of the year. We're now almost at 100 million registered users. And I'll go into some more changes. So let's start out by backing up into March. Actually, at the beginning of the year, we started observing changes in countries that were being affected by school closures, but we didn't have a large presence there to begin with. So it really wasn't until mid-March that we started seeing these spikes at a global scale. So what you'll see here, not to scale, is the trends in daily registrations on our different registration segments. So what I think is most interesting is the shape of these charts. So you see parents are spiking first. They're hearing the news that their schools may be closed and they have to somehow teach their children at home for the first time. Teachers have a couple spikes. A lot of teachers in the US were given 1 week to prepare to teach online for the first time ever. And then learners are spiking throughout that. They're being driven to Khan Academy either out of self-motivation or driven by their parents and their teachers. To respond, the Khan Academy team scrambled. We released Google Docs, live streams, help desk articles, and webinars. I'll highlight just a couple of the most popular. We created daily schedules at different grade levels for parents who have never homeschooled before to be able to structure their children's days. And we had a team of volunteer translator getting all this content into additional languages. Sal Khan, our founder, he began doing daily live streams from his home. We call these Homeroom with Sal, and they're still going on today. They started as just advice for parents, talking to other educational experts, and they've expanded to a wide range of speakers. The daily schedules saw over 750K views in their first month, and the homerooms were seeing around 15 to 20,000 views per show. So we were becoming an emergency resource and trying to step up and provide some answers there. I'll now go into more changes in usage that we saw in March and beyond that. My primary metric for the following slides will be total learning time, which is the total amount of time spent on site by all users. If you look at the number of daily active learners, you see very similar trends. So here we're looking at weekly total learning time. In the blue is the US and red is outside of the US, and then the dashed lines are the previous year. So you see again in US for learning, outside the US and learning time a little bit sooner, we're starting to pick up, and then the US follows maybe a few weeks after that. And we continued to grow in usage through the end of the month, peaking at about 150% year-over-year increase. That has since been flattening out over the summer. We're now at about half of that growth rate. We are a seasonal product. We tend to follow the US school year, so it's not surprising to see usage come down in the summer. And though we're very curious to see what this new back to school will bring in terms of usage. As I mentioned before, students might use Khan Academy out of self-motivation or driven by their parent or teacher. We can get a proxy of this based on their account data. So a parent or a teacher can link their Khan Academy account with their student's account. And that's a really good proxy for motivation, though obviously parents may just tell their students to use Khan Academy. We don't have the data trail for that. So I think what's most interesting here is to look at trends, maybe than exact distribution. But what I'm showing in this chart is the distribution of total learning time in the weeks leading up to that mid-March spike and then the weeks following. So on the top, you see that before the COVID spike, we were at about 44% of learning time coming from uncoached learners, and that decreased following the spike. So that self-directed use case is not as strong when schools close. Our teacher influence grew a little bit. Internationally, this change was even more drastic. We didn't have as large of a classroom presence in some places. So if you look outside the US, this changed from 24% to 36%.
And I'm sorry, Libby, this is John. And is the denominator there the number of active sessions? So that's learning time during this period. And the denominator there would be something like the the millions, the 18 million, I think it was, of monthly sessions, just because
Yep, so same metric, and the metric is actually minutes, so it's total minutes. So what of total time is coming from students who have a coach or have no coach at all.
So it's a time, okay, which it says right there. Okay, great.
Thanks for the clarifying question. And I'd say to me, the most interesting, and while a small percentage of total learning time, the influence of parents doubled. And again, I think they're influencing the uncoached segment as well. And this was a big wake-up call for us. We've been heavily involved in classrooms the past few years, but we have very little resources for parents, and they've always been an integral part of the learning experience. And but especially really critical now while students are trying to learn at home. In addition to consuming content and practicing, many students use Khan Academy for test prep. We have a specific test prep product for SAT, LSAT, and Praxis, as well as content in our libraries around standardized tests. So in this chart, we're looking at again, total minutes weekly for that test prep product, which is vast majority SAT. And here we see a really different trend than what we were seeing in global usage. In March, rather than growing, we saw a huge decline. And this is following some of the announcements that College Board would cancel SAT tests. Anecdotally, as we chat with some districts who were using Khan Academy more for a standardized test prep use case, they were also seeing some decline in this time. So we're kind of concluding that test prep use case, which drives a lot of ed tech usage, isn't there right now while schools are out of session or from home. For SAT specifically, that is starting to recover, at least partially due to College Board's late May announcement that fall admin dates were open for registration. Though obviously the future of test prep is very uncertain as College Board figures out how to administer tests safely and colleges decide whether or not they're going to require standardized tests in the same way. As you all know, device access and connectivity are a great source of inequity in accessing online learning materials. One way we can demonstrate that from an online learning tools data is the difference in growth by device and geography. So what you see in this chart is the year-over-year change by month, again in that total learning time, split by international in the red and US in the blue for usage in our app versus usage on the web. And in both areas, but especially international, you see much stronger growth coming from the app. And we hypothesize a lot of this is coming from families that maybe don't have a desktop computer or struggle with connectivity and rely on the app's download feature, who are still trying to find ways to get online. Additionally, two countries where we have a strong local presence, Brazil and Peru, also did not follow the same growth trends that we were seeing globally. In March, their usage did not spike in the way that a lot of other countries did. And our team on the ground believe this is in large part due to challenges with connectivity outside of schools. And so I'm looking forward to discussing with this panel what role EdTech can play in improving access to our resources. And then just another note, I think agreeing with the previous speaker, we need better ways to measure inequity in education with school closures. Historically, our analytics team has used teacher self-reported school as a proxy, and we can connect this to NCES data on free and reduced lunch. And when you connect this to students, we have that information for about roughly half of our very active learners. And in March, we did not see a drastic change in the usage distribution of teachers with students from schools with the majority FRL qualifying students. But we don't necessarily believe that that's sufficient evidence to say that we are reaching high need students, especially now where we continue to have students learning from home without access to their school's tech and resources. Again, I think another really important topic for this group of people to be addressing. But in the meantime, what's next for Khan Academy and school closure response? I'll highlight just a couple other things that we've been actively working on. We're pulling together more teachers and parent resources. We've taken that hodgepodge of Google Docs I shared earlier and put them on a real website, keeplearning.khanacademy.org, and we've translated that into Spanish to support our international audience as well as our ESL learners in the US. We've developed a course for teachers to learn on Khan Academy how to use Khan Academy with their students. And then our other really big area of focus is figuring out how we can help close the greater learning gaps expected for this coming school year. Both teachers that you talk to and researchers predict an unprecedented summer slide this year. Many students will have done no learning since March. One way we're trying to help this is we released a new series of Get Ready Math classes. And these are curations of the most important prerequisites for a specific grade, so that teachers can, at the beginning of the school year, assign these to their students to identify and rectify gaps, and then get them started on grade level math material. And we've also been trying to promote and push these directly to students and parents this summer, so they can try to prevent some of that summer slide. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much, Libby. Enable my video again, try to keep this going. That is fascinating, and some real consistencies with what we heard from Jamie as well. And at the end, maybe we'll have a conversation about learners versus teachers, as well as parents, and how we see people accessing resources. In the interest of time, I'll pass it now to Amanda Baker with Quizlet.
Awesome, thanks. Let me get started here. Oh, sorry, just 1 second. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Also doing the 2 desktop thing, and it's not recognizing one of them, but we'll see. There we go. Okay, awesome.
I'll give you an audio check when it comes up.
Okay. All right, I will just have to use the same screen. Looks like it's not recognizing the second one, but no problem. We will just keep rolling with these technical difficulties and make it work. Okay, so let me switch over and I'll share the screen. That should work. There we go. Now I've got it going. Okay, awesome. All right, so let's share the screen. Go from here. Okay, and 1 second. Okay. Now, I think you guys can see all my panel stuff too, right? So yeah. Let me switch to the other one. Okay, let me switch to the other one. Sorry about that.
Application share.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Okay, that should work much better now. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think
all right. Okay, great. So let me get started, and I'll make sure to be aware of time. I know we're running a little bit over here. And so my name is Amanda Baker. I'm head of analytics at Quizlet, and actually Shane already gave a little bit of introduction to Quizlet, so I'll make sure not to take too much time there as we are running short on time. But just to introduce you to a little bit of numbers that's relevant to this talk today. We have over 50 million monthly active users across 130 countries. And our learning platform, like Shane said, caters to a bunch of different types of learning uses, things like that. So based on our usage data, we estimate 2/3 of high school students in the US are on the platform in a given school year. That's why we are focusing on this US high school students research project here, as well as we have a large portion of college students as well, higher ed. So, our data shows trends in how and what students are studying online. We have a much larger research report coming out next week. So, but in the interest of time, since we have a short window here, I'm just going to be presenting one section of that report. And the one that I'm going to be focusing on is the effects of remote learning on different income levels. Okay, so it's funny how much Jamie and mine talks kind of go together, and also Libby. We did not plan any of this, and this is all kind of just coming together as a great thesis statement. As Jamie talked about, US high school studying never returned to normal. That's also what we saw on Quizlet. And to give you a little bit of comparison across other countries, remember Quizlet is in 130 countries across the globe. And to highlight some of those, although no country was prepared for the quick pivot to online learning, we did see in some countries that they were able to return to levels not only to normal, but actually engage more than before. So I'm comparing time periods kind of early in the calendar year. Again, as was discussed earlier, COVID-19 hit countries kind of in different time periods throughout this calendar year. So if we compare study levels to kind of in the beginning of the calendar year before COVID had a major impact on most countries, and then look at their kind of peak engagement during their remote learning periods this last spring, this is kind of what we end up with, is that the US was at about 72% at peak in US high school, and their equivalent grades in all these other countries Mostly that's kind of like the latter half of secondary school in most of these other countries. You'll see South Korea was, hitting peak 300%. We had Brazil over 300%. You still had some other countries like France that also did not return to normal levels for US high school studying, but others did in Europe, such as Italy and Poland. So very interesting kind of how that all worked out. So when we saw this comparison across these countries for the US, we wanted to kind of dig into the US more and understand what was going on there specifically for high school students. And so what I want to focus on today is, again, one part of this research report that we're going to be putting out, and that's focusing on high school students studying as a factor of income level in that student's area. So we are taking zip code data from study sessions that we get from students, and we are comparing that zip code to US Census data. So we have aggregate studying sessions by zip code by age group, and we compare that to US Census data, which gives us the median income level of that zip code. And if we kind of put those things together, we can understand how this breaks up in terms of median income level of that area that that student is in. So this one is comparing to right before COVID hit. So kind of exactly what Jamie was doing, comparing to kind of going week by week, what was the breakdown of usage in each week. This one we're normalizing to kind of that very first week in March. That's why you'll see that one's at 100%. And you can see basically as March 16th came around, that's when most US school systems moved to remote learning and shut down at least, and tried to find a remote learning solution. You can see those numbers kind of really dropped there. And what's interesting here that we want to point out is that as we separate this out by income level for that region that that student is in, you can see the lowest, the blue line, which is 0 to 50K income level, originally was doing pretty well compared to the other groups. But kind of as the weeks went on, they actually started to drop and became the lowest performing group out of all these four here, while the other three kind of stayed together and did see some improvement in usage. So, you know, after school closures took effect, basically students studying in low income regions fell off the most over time. And so students in lower income regions relied on mobile devices. So this is, I think, again, something that Jamie and something that, that Libby was just talking about. There's a lot there about device usage and what can be really helpful. And so we saw this pattern, again, if you take those income brackets and you look at the usage pattern, this is % of US high school students' study visits on a desktop. You can see that during remote learning, different patterns emerged of usage of desktops by the different income groups. So in the beginning, kind of pre-COVID, if we want to call it, you can see that while the lowest income group did have the lowest amount of desktop usage, there wasn't quite the gap that appears later on. You can just see with that highest income group and then the next one there, that they really spike up, and almost exclusively the usage of, the studying of on Quizlet by US high school students in that income bracket becomes pretty much desktop usage. So students in higher income regions may have been able to stay on track with studying as they moved more to desktops to accommodate their school day. So as you remember in the previous chart, you can see that in the beginning, the students in the lower income regions, they were doing pretty well in terms of tracking with the other income groups. But as time went on, they basically started to be the lowest performing. And this could be an indicating, this could be one of the factors to that, is that they kind of hit these headwinds. If all you have is a mobile device in which to, do your studying and get your things done, it can just becoming really cumbersome, and that could maybe lead to them not performing as well later on. So, the Pew Research Center backs up this claim of digital divide for lower income households. They have done several studies on this year after year. The most recent one that I was able to find was in 2019. And they just talk about how the digital divide persists even as lower income Americans, make gains in tech adoption. So they say that, if you take 2019, 26% of adults living in very low income households were smartphone dependent internet users. Meaning that they own a smartphone, but they do not use broadband internet at home. And they directly link this to, to the homework gap for other students. The disparity in online access is also apparent in what has been called the homework gap, and 35% of lower income households did not have internet connection at home. So they're basically relying on that device there. You know, this is, again, one part of something that we found was really interesting during remote learning, that we feel like there was an outsized negative impact on students in lower income areas. You know, the motivation was there for all students prior to COVID-19. If you look at study usage kind of prior to that, still very strong. You see a lot of equal usage. However, post shutdown, you know, those resources just weren't available for everyone. And again, they may just be in households where it wasn't able to, the support is just not available. And as remote learning continues, lower income students are at a higher risk of falling behind unless their pain points are addressed. And exactly kind of what Libby was talking about, if you think about if that learning basically stopped in March, what does that look like now? And there's been a lot of research reports on that to help define kind of what that learning gap could be. And some of those research reports talk about if learning stopped in March, that you could be almost a whole grade level behind in learning because of that. And I will wrap up there to make it really quick and get us back on track.
All right, great, thank you very much. A fascinating set of kind of similarities. So thank you, Amanda. Those are really some very interesting similarities, but some other differences. We're aggregating, we're collecting questions, and we're prioritizing those. I just wanted to, so we'll keep those for the end and making sure we'll make time for those, even if we take a little bit away from our panel, because those are important. I want to hand it over now. First thing, I also wanted to encourage folks, if you have kind of conversations or discussion or kind of more of a comment, please do keep using the chat as we are. If you have a specific question that's more like a tech question or a material question, if you could please put that in the Q&A, that will help us pull those out a little bit. We haven't had that used that much so far. So if you could, that would be great. With that, I want to hand it over to my friend Kim Wallace to talk about barriers to EdTech integration.
Okay, great, thank you. And oops, sorry, gonna click off on that. Done. So the best part of this whole thing is the irony of all of the EdTech problems we've had in this webinar so far are replicated across what we see happening in districts and in schools all across the nation. And so we're not alone. We're supposedly the experts, and we are still having the same kind of similar issues as everybody else. So I'm just going to launch in and talk about overcoming those barriers to EdTech integrations during COVID-19, but I'll provide a little bit of context first. Let me see if I can get my screen so I can actually do this as a presentation.
Yeah, if you just hit the present mode in the upper right-hand corner, Kim.
Yeah, it's blocked is the problem. Let me get rid of this and then go there. Okay, how's that looking?
Great.
Okay, all right, so I've been in public education for 26 years, started off as a high school English teacher at the age of 22, worked my way up to being a superintendent in a large Bay Area school district, and just recently decided to take a different route from there. And this was right pre-COVID, and I decided to let my contract expire and do some independent consulting, which is what I've launched into now. As you can see on the first slide, I borrowed this from another website, but it was interesting because it shows the anatomy of a 20th century classroom, which is what you see as your pretty typical classroom, and then the blended learning classroom. But we've gotten, a lot of people are jumping straight from the 20th century classroom into this post-COVID world classroom, which isn't even a blended learning classroom because so many districts have decided to protect students and staff by doing fully distance education. And so it's a huge leap for people who have been living in that 20th century classroom to move into that blended learning, much less into 100% online. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those barriers that exist, that have always existed in technology integration, but how they are exacerbated and how we might approach them today. So there's just really the bottom line is the physical barriers to technology integration. Do the teachers and students and staff have the availability of the equipment? Do they have infrastructure that is coherent and talks to each other? And do we also have the ability to do the technology troubleshooting in real time? And those are the main just bottom line barriers that we have to really fully integrating technology into instruction. And so approaches that we might look at are making sure, obviously, that we have all the up-to-date hardware and accessories for teachers and families. And the other three presenters, we did not plan this, but they talked a lot about equity. And there's equity not only with families, but also with teachers and with some of the different environments that people have that they're living in that just don't make it really accessible. Universal high-speed internet is also a key component there. And then when you look at the coherence of your infrastructure, are you mandating that there are certain platforms that people are using? Are they all over the map? Do we have data storage, redundancy, backups, making sure that we're limiting those frustrations that come from the infrastructure issues? And then just the technical troubleshooting for teachers and for the families that are trying to use the technologies that they may have never used before. So having that just-in-time tech support, doing short demos for the users so that they know how to use the digital systems, and you can break down that barrier. And also just really having it being educator-friendly language and step-by-step problem solving, because educators are not technology people. They are people who are teaching in the classroom, and they need it to be explained in a way that they can comprehend. This next level of barriers are really just the psychological and pedagogical barriers to technology integration. And this includes what are people's personal beliefs and attitudes towards technology. Today, it doesn't matter quite as much what your attitude is towards technology, because you don't have an option. You have to use the technology. There's no longer the opt-in or opt-out. Everybody's using it. And so, but it's important to examine what are those prior relationships that people have had with technology, set up new experiences that have success embedded in them so that people can rewire their thinking. It's a lot of like the math mentality, people saying, I'm bad at math. And now you have to retrain them to think, okay, yes, I can learn math, but I may need to learn it in a different way. And then also to create those conditions so that people have agency and ownership and can do some innovations and feel like they are actually personalizing it for themselves. Also looking at how distance learning worked, and one of the earlier speakers talked about how in the same report there was great success with distance learning, and also it's a total tragic disaster. And I think people have had a variety of experiences with it, but I think getting that feedback, what worked, what didn't work, and then actually acting on that feedback and implementing a vision for long-term distance learning, because this is not going to be ending likely anytime soon. And then also finally, the sufficiency of knowledge, skills, and resources, helping the professionals who are delivering the materials to get that good, strong professional development that's differentiated for their skill levels and understanding, helping the families navigate those online systems so that they aren't kept from actually participating fully, and then also providing those resources and curriculum guides in a variety of media. And then finally, the last is the institutional barriers that we have either created inadvertently or purposely. And a lot of those have been turned on their head since school buildings are no longer being occupied. And so we have to look at what are the situational and organizational barriers. And you know, people keep using the frame, the new normal. It shouldn't define us, we should define it. And then another aspect to that is a big one. It's acknowledging that there's a work-life balance paradigm shift for teachers and parents, because a lot of teachers have their own children at home. A lot of parents are working at home. And how do we navigate that new territory and develop those practical schedules for activities for learning time? Then there's also structural and social inequities that we need to address, and making sure that the content that our technology companies are delivering are free from racial, linguistic, socioeconomic biases, also have positive representations of every ethnicity, language, translations, sexual orientation, gender, religion, etc. So it doesn't just cater to your typical mainstream student. And then also just look at the differences and having an awareness of how different students learn, families communicate, and have access in a variety of communities. And then also, this doesn't really have to do with the ed tech instructional piece, but it's a key point with what school has done and what kids value and teachers value, and that is around the culture and tradition of school. I think there's a lot of mourning and loss that people are feeling being online because they don't have those pep rallies and assemblies and lunchtime and the cultural identities that people develop within school. And so really trying to think about how do we honor those traditions of the past, but also create opportunities, especially if we're in this for the long term. And then finally, my favorite quote by John Dewey, more than 100 years ago, it's still relevant today. If we teach today's children as we did yesterday's, we rob them of tomorrow. And so I think it's really important for the people who are in the classroom, in the online environments, as well as the people who are creating the content, really think about what is it that we want for our kids. And we can't just replicate what happened in the classroom online. We have to be really deliberate and critical and thoughtful around how we are working with them in the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Kim. I really appreciate the kind of tiered approach that you've taken in thinking about that. As it's not just, do you have access to a computer, broadband, at these levels at which this happens, especially under COVID, is really important to keep in mind. So I think with this, we're at time, but I'm gonna take the privilege of the moderator and ask, all the speakers, if you could enable your video, and we'll take a little bit of time for we'll take a couple minutes for Q&A, and then we'll transition into the panel session. So first, I think there's a question for Amanda at Quizlet. Do you know what the data looks like? I have here at the country level, the data that you showed.
You mean like by income level? Is that what the question is?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. That was for Jamie.
Oh, okay.
Going between 6 screens. Yeah.
Any idea what part of what data that was referring to?
Anna, you recorded the question initially? I don't recall where that came from.
Oh, yeah, that was somewhere toward the very beginning of the presentation. I think maybe when we were talking about districts.
Yeah.
We can move
and
on.
Probably the drop off in access and just seeing, like where did students disappear? Where did they recover the most? We do have that at the country level. I think the harder thing for us is trying to align time points on like when did the closures happen in all of those different countries in quite the same way. The United States, we saw our data just have this incredibly clear, it was like 1 week and everyone just went home. And in a lot of the other countries that I was looking at the UK, I was looking at Canada, and it's actually a little bit fuzzier for us.
Okay. Great. And then I think that we had those other differences. There's a question about, do you have any measure of effect sizes?
And which differences was that referring to?
Yeah, again, I'm sorry.
No.
Nana, do we have
I'm sorry that I couldn't see the chat as I was going.
What happens when we save the questions for the end?
You know what? It actually doesn't matter on this one. We don't have any of this research published yet. A lot of that is in process, but no, I don't have those stats to give right now.
Okay. I see there's a question. I don't know if it's a question about free and reduced lunch. Yeah, I think with that, maybe we're good on questions that I see, unless anybody else, and Sasha, the Fauci effect, I see Alexander Dietrichson, who is Sasha. Is the Fauci effect how do you mean that? You can say or chat. You can type that in. Maybe in the interest of time, we'll actually go, why don't we go to the panel, and I'll quickly introduce who we have for panelists. Let me show the screen here. And we are joined by Roddy Bunchoy, who is the Associate Superintendent of Instruction at the Davis Joint Unified School District. So Roddy, thanks for joining us. You've met everyone else here, so people know who they are. I'm going to keep this open and on. And I'm going to begin with my first question to ask each of you, to speak to, well, what's different under COVID? And if you can provide a brief summary of what changed at your institution and how you deliver educational services, or how you provide your programs. Many technology providers kind of changed their service model, changed their pricing model to make things free. Maybe we should begin, why don't we begin with Roddy, and then we could go up, go Roddy, Kim, if you can remember, Jamie, we'll go upwards here, Libby and Amanda. I think it's all right.
Thanks, John. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for letting me be here. It's an honor. I want to underscore that John mentioned that we're in a messy time right now, and that couldn't be more true. My name is Roddy Bunchoy, Associate Superintendent of Instructional Services in Davis Joint Unified. That's between Sacramento and the Bay area. We're in full-blown pragmatic mode right now. As you can imagine, most every school in California and in the country is starting this month. So there's a hustle to get everything in place, to prep staff, to implement what policy we do have, as well as communicate and work with our communities who are experiencing quite a bit of anxiety along the way. And then there's a million things we're trying to troubleshoot in between, technically, logistically, and culturally as well. So what's changed? Most feels like everything in so many ways. But in short, I think at a high level, the three big buckets, one is technologically. There's all kinds of shifts in the way we think about the tools that we use, the mediums that we use to teach and learn, and the way we communicate as well. Instructionally, Kim in her last presentation mentioned a lot of kind of the paradigm shifts in pedagogy. So we're feeling a lot of changes home in our district, particularly around more consistency and centralization of the way we operate. Traditionally, at least in our district, every school has been kind of its own fiefdom. It's been highly decentralized, and there was a lot of autonomy, not only at the classroom level, but at the school level as well. And so when everything hit on Friday the 13th in March, everything changed. We pulled together as an organization and began to centralize and build out expectations for more consistency in the way we operate instruction. That was to support staff, that was to support students who were entering a world that was before unknown to them. A lot of that was accompanied by a lot of professional development, much more than we have ever had. And we've been baking that into our DNA as we think about the supports that are needed. And then at a high level, the third piece would be the cultural shift that we're experiencing. A lot of innovation, a lot more risk-taking, a lot more allowances for trying new things and being intentional about the way we reimagine the way we do business. And through that, there's been some positive byproducts, particularly with leadership development. A lot of teachers, a lot of administrators have been stepping up in new ways. So I think I anticipate and hope that we'll see a whole generation of new leaders with new ideas and new perspectives across the realm of public education. And then fortunately, we've been lucky. This is not the case with all districts, but we actually have amazing labor relations. We've pulled our associations in super close and have been able to collaborate in very effective ways in order to move together. So that's a shift for us and something that we greatly value. So at a high level, that's kind of our big change. And then I know there's a lot more details that'll come in later questions.
Thanks, Roddy. Roddy and I worked together in Davis and went to school together with John. And so we have a lot of background information for each other. So I'll just co-sign that everything that Roddy said is pretty similar from across the nation in the conversations that I've had with other superintendents. But also just to talk a little bit more about really just the bottom line of that educating students, it takes in so many other elements, feeding students, transportation, making sure that they're safe. There's so many other layers. And I think that's what COVID has really uncovered is what the educational institution is really only a fraction instructionally. And so we have all kinds of services that we provide. We provide counseling services, we provide social services, family supports. And so those were really the main things that we were tackling in Fremont at the beginning. 35,000 students, 42 schools, trying to figure out how do we feed students who are being fed every single day. And so it was really working on the lowest level of Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, and also simultaneously trying to envision how do we actually change education for the better. Because in some ways, this is the day that I was waiting for, where we actually could embed really new innovative practices into the system, yet there's so many challenges along the way that you have to address first. And so I think that where people are getting to now is creating those alliances and memorandums of understanding with the labor groups, and making sure that we're all trying to figure out how to keep everybody safe. And that's really the bottom line. And the shift from where we were from March through June was really triage, and now it's about intentional implementation. And so that's the conversations that are happening right now.
I think I'm next, right? John, I was next on your list.
That sounds good.
Great. It's funny that you would say that. I feel like even though we're in a very different position as a company, an ed tech provider in this space, we also were in like triage mode and are now in intentional planning mode. Our triage was, how do we make sure that as many people have access as is possible right now in this emergency situation? So even though our programs were, designed to be used at least partially online, and so we didn't have to make major changes to the products themselves at the time, we did start a learn from home program that enabled anyone who was a customer to have unlimited student licenses during the spring school closures. So if they wanted to put every single one of their students on the products and send out all of those passwords and email addresses, we were like, great, add them all. And we also, kind of to Roddy's point, recognizing how important teacher PD was during this time, we also gave unlimited access to our online on-demand teacher education portal, which is kind of a bunch of amazing literacy courses for teaching reading, teaching literacy, especially in this blended way. And we saw just insane uptick from educators really looking for those resources during this time. So those were kind of our reactionary changes, and now we're moving into more planned changes. What we obviously did a lot to try and survey our educators, find out what was working, what wasn't working in this new normal. And then we're now in that phase of trying to release a bunch of new things in terms of support structures and resources that we're hoping will help with remote learning in the fall.
I think we'll go to Libby next. I don't know if that's the order I initially set them in, but that's what they appear on my screen, so I'm going to go with it. Thanks.
It's a good memory test. Yeah, really very much to that. I think for us, the immediate response was just trying to keep the site running as we were hitting 2x traffic volume. So a big piece was reaching out to funders to try to help cover our hosting costs. And then I kind of mentioned it a bit earlier, but briefly, ramping up our parent resources. That was an area where we're not heavily involved, and all of a sudden we have thousands and thousands of parents looking to us. So development there, as well as stepping on the gas with our teacher PD. And then I think going into this school year, again, as I mentioned, really focused on remediation in different ways that we hadn't developed before through our Get Ready courses.
Thank you.
On the Quizlet side, so a couple of things, you know, like I said, we're in 130 countries, so we were noticing this happening kind of, you know, early, obviously in Asia, and we basically wanted to do something to help. So we started to provide our paid teacher product for free for any teachers first in those early affected areas, including, you know, and then we kind of saw, okay, well, now it's hitting Italy really hard. Let's do it for Italy. And then kind of after that, it was just everyone. So then we were like, great, let's just offer free teacher kind of for every teacher all over. And so that's what we ended up doing, you know, and that's just highlights kind of how crazy the last, this whole calendar year has been. To think back, that was just March. So offering some free trial resources for teachers there. It's things like, you know, you can track progress for your class. That really helps when you don't have them in front of you and you need to know how they're doing. You can, you know, track their progress on Quizlet in terms of using the study modes. And then the other thing that we did is Quizlet Live is a really important classroom component for a lot of teachers in their learning, in how they teach and educate and make it fun to teach in class. But Quizlet Live requires you working with another person right next to you, and you have screens right next to you. And obviously that's not happening right now. So we quickly pivoted on that. We were lucky that there was a hack week just kind of a couple weeks that we had planned after remote learning started in the US, that we quickly hacked out a version of that works, that you don't have to be on teams, that you can just be individual. So, and you can compete against each other and you don't have to be anywhere near each other anymore. And that was really popular. We saw that, you know, we saw like 50% of our usage switched over to that type of mode. And they were really, really grateful for that because they still wanted to try and add in some fun elements of fun to learning when it was just a really tough period. So some of the ways that we adapted the product to help teachers in this really stressful time.
Great. I'm struck by the focus on teachers and the focus on parents, and seeing that reflected in the usage data. I'll just say, to me, that was striking and wasn't something that I had thought about before we had this conversation. Is that, you know, you think, oh, everybody's gone to learning online. Well, actually, we're trying to go to teaching online first, and the learning integration was quite a bit different. That in different patterns, and those drops are interesting and dramatic to think about how that's going to happen for the, you know, as we go into the fall, with most schools being closed, you know, being online, I should say, not being closed, but being fully online as well. Yeah, it strikes me that may be something that will continue. So knowing that we probably wouldn't talk, given Roddy, about technology wasn't at the first kind of thing top of mind, to Kim's point, you know, working from the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy. Can Kim and then Roddy, can you speak about, you know, your focus during the pandemic, and then how technology was incorporated, or how the systemic decisions around technology were made to the degree that they were at all?
Yes, the first thing that we needed to do was overcome that first barrier, which is the physical barrier, and making sure that the equipment was out there in students' hands. And so what we did was we just deployed all of the Chromebooks from all of the school sites and had it so that families could come and pick up those Chromebooks. And then also we had to work with our internet providers to see if we could get some universal access, or at least very low cost access, because those are the two bottom lines. If you don't have the tool or the internet access, you really can't do anything in the learning or teaching realm. And so that was really what our first plan of attack was, is to make sure that everything was out there. And then luckily, our partners with all of the technology companies that we've been working with, they just came to the party and said, here's access, how can we help? And we're just amazing supports to us in making sure that we had math programs and literacy programs and any other sort of tools that we had been paying for. They said, here's open access to everything. Let us know how we can support. And that was immeasurable, really, to see how that community came together to make sure that kids continued learning. And so that was really our first approach.
So, and can I just, and so was it working with the already existing partners? It sounds like ed tech companies that you are working with stepped up, and is that really probably who you focused on, was the community of known kind of companies that you'd already been working with? Because I'm sure you got quite a few additional calls.
Yes, I think I had at least 300 emails a week from ed tech companies. I mean, it was literally all I did was sift through emails. And so leveraging those existing partnerships that we already had and the contracts we already had, that was, I would say, about 70–80% of it. And then there were some new folks that came on board for gaps that we didn't have filled, and we ended up using some of those. Like Roddy was saying earlier, very diverse and disaggregated teaching and learning experiences throughout Fremont. There was no standardized, like everybody's teaching this, you're on page 10 on Labor Day. Totally not that style in Fremont either. And so we had to honor some of the pre-existing tools that teachers had been using just on their own that weren't necessarily sanctioned by the district. And so I think that the new shift in the mode that we'll be moving into is that makes it really challenging for teachers and for kids if they have 6 teachers a day and they're all using a totally different platform. And so I think moving into that place where we're saying these 3 tools or these 5 tools are the ones that we're going to be using, because it just makes it a little bit more challenging when it's the wild, wild west out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Similar story for us right out the gate. Unfortunately, we started a little bit behind in terms of our infrastructure, in terms of our technology. We're far from one-to-one. We did not have any coherent, consistent support with PD around tech tools. So there wasn't a whole lot more than random acts of excellence across our district. So the first thing we did, because it was a frenzy, I mean, the rug was pulled out from underneath us as for everyone, is we forced ourselves and maintained some discipline to stop and come up with a coherent strategy before we just, move forward. We were watching other districts. Some had started distance learning immediately in other districts around us, and we actually put the brakes on for 2 weeks. One, to put together resources for students at home from some of our guests here, Khan Academy and others. And then that gave us the time to develop a professional development strategy for our teachers, so that way we could enter into the distance learning space a little bit more thoughtfully, and as well as develop a tech plan at the same time. So on the tech side, or on the hardware and access side, we deployed what we did have. I mean, everything, we just totally looted all our Chromebooks and our sites and our libraries, and we distributed as part of our meal distribution plan. We're able to get machines out quite quickly. And then for access, we had to pull our community and identify and communicate with with everyone, all our families, to identify who had limited access or no access. And then all our budgets went out the window, and we threw money at hotspots to make sure that we did what we had to do. So it was definitely emergency, redefining what we did. But from that PD strategy, we're able to integrate thoughtful usage of tools. That included, like most folks, Google Classroom, because it was free, it was a low threshold, it was easy to get into for course management. And then video conferencing software was the other big one. And I got a funny story with that one that might come in more, might be a little bit later, but we immediately moved to WebEx because we couldn't get someone to pick up the phone in Zoom. And so, and we had to do something. And so we locked in a contract. This is a pitfall, by the way. We locked in a contract and then realized they didn't have breakout rooms. And we realized the pedagogical and instructional value of collaboration in video conferencing. So guess what? We have 2 contracts now, one with Zoom and with WebEx. But because that was the stumbling, and we were doing the best that we could. So those decisions were made thoughtfully, but without the full backing of the research and the time to investigate and explore like we typically do in school districts. But that was kind of the first few months.
Great. Thank you, Roddy. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to hear about the scramble for both on both sides as well, right? That we're all scrambling to figure this out. So with that, let's go to the next question. So to ask maybe, and we'll go this time, Libby, Jamie, and Amanda, for your companies, how did your relationship with teachers and with schools change during the pandemic?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we're a free product and we've been working with teachers for a long time. And we also have a pilot licensed product with districts lately. And so initially, I don't think we were speaking directly as much to schools as we were before, because as mentioned earlier, they're scrambling to feed their students. So we were not top of mind very initially. Later on, as we chatted more with our districts, one decision we made was to extend that contract for some districts through the summer so that they could stay connected to their students and have reporting on their students through the summer, which they hadn't planned on previously. And then I'd say more significantly on the teacher side, we ramped up the type of communications we had. We were maybe doing a webinar here and there and still kind of experimenting with that format. And we did a ton, especially to onboard new teachers or teachers that maybe hadn't wanted to use tech or weren't familiar with tech in the same way. So really ramping up new teacher onboarding, as well as trying when we could to get feedback from teachers, because that's really how we figure out what we need to develop, but the data can only tell you so much, whereas the teacher is going to tell you actually what they're experiencing. And that's kind of how some of the Get Ready product came to light, was just through those conversations with teachers.
Okay.
I feel like I've kind of spoke to this already, but we were just more connected with our educators than ever before. I think to Roddy and Kim's point, we were also more connected with the Lexia leadership teams, the group of people who were responsible for the implementations of our program at each customer than maybe ever before. Simply because if you already had somebody that you were working with and you already had some knowledge built up amongst your educators, amongst your students, it just made sense to try and expand that for them. So we were, our customer success implementation team was deploying so many Zoom meetings. I can't even imagine how many Zoom meetings to get all the new educators in districts up and running, deploying new materials for them. So we were really in contact maybe more than ever before with them. Our big gap, because we've been such a school-based program, is that I would say we're still working to see how to change our relationship with parents who really have not been a part of our not been a core member of our ecosystem up until this point. And suddenly they're at the center of things, or at least in the middle of the mix.
Yeah, well, often, especially as schools are figuring out what to do, parents and many of us who are parents know that we're front and center very much, maybe even a little more than we want to be as we figure things out.
Yeah, and kind of playing off of what Jamie just said, I'm actually gonna kind of answer or gonna comment along those lines, which is exactly that. Like parents became more involved, and we actually introduced a parents pay component of Quizlet. So we have a teacher product and a student product, and we just really invested more time in building out that parents pay for the student product, because you had that happening, like parents were needing to step in and being the educator at some points or wanting to. For various reasons. And so we really started having that relationship there that we have only had for children who are much younger and obviously need their parents to manage their accounts. Now we had kind of high schoolers, older kids, where we had parents involved that wanted to get them a Quizlet account that was paid. So that was really, I think that was really interesting for us there, and we are going to continue to support that product.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's go next. So let's talk about equity issues. Maybe here I'm gonna, so how did these changes, and again, some of the presentations that you had spoke to this already, so maybe if you can extend that, how did these changes that we've spoken about impact inequities in education, especially for students from minoritized backgrounds? And what are you doing to try to remedy these effects? And I think that really applies to everyone, right? So this time, I think maybe we'll go Libby, Jamie, Kim, Roddy, which is how you appear on my screen. I'll choose that as the randomness here.
Yeah, and we've talked about it, probably several different areas of inequity in education right now, and especially with the pandemic. With regards to device access, that was something that I think we historically didn't try to solve. We're a free product, and we know that there are other agencies that are helping students get to that free product. But I think in this crisis, we have to step up and do more than that. And one area we're doing that is through advocacy. We're following along with Common Sense Media is leading work to get Congress to provide more funding. They're specifically asking for $3 to $5 billion funding to close the digital divide. So we've signed letters with them. We're in active conversations. And I think part of this process is recognizing where we have expertise and where we don't, and what new partnerships we can build. So Common Sense Media has a history of advocacy. We don't have that same. So partnering closely with them to use our brand and our influence where we can. And then similarly with more local in-person resources. So we've been meeting with a group they're called COVID-19 Parent Support Coalition, which is a group of other organizations that are fixing different parts of the problem. So some people might be focused on lunches, some are focused on devices, work content, and making sure that the people on the ground who have better reach with devices or directly with high need families can get people to us. And again, they have the expertise to solve that. A really cool one is Learning Heroes. They work directly with parents, and one problem they have identified and really researched is that a lot of parents don't actually know the level of their student. They assume they're on grade level or higher. So now when they're all of a sudden put into this situation to help their students find resources, they're not equipped to do so. So they have an assessment to help their parents figure out where they can put their students, and then we can partner with them. So it's okay, you have the expertise and the reach with parents of high needs families, and you're already helping them figure out where their students are. And then we can tell you which content to pair with that. So I think we've got a ton more to do, but we've stepped up specifically into advocacy and more partnerships than what we had been doing before.
That's great. And with the name and reach of Khan Academy, I'm sure that can be very powerful to help move those efforts forward. That's great.
On devices specifically, in one way we were almost lucky in this moment that we had a new support for new different types of devices already that has been in the works for a year, we were able to launch in July, which is exciting for this fall. But it means that a huge part of our emphasis right now is on communication and making sure that all the parents know the myriad ways that you can actually get on, or which devices do work. They don't try to access on one device that doesn't work, even though they have another one, and the intersections there with first language for a lot of parents. Do the parents have the resources in the language that they need them in order to be the main tech provider now for getting the program downloaded and up and running on the applications? So that's been a big effort for us. And then for us, the offline materials, we've been indexed on schools where teachers have been telling us for a long time they want paper, they want to be able to print the PDFs out and put them in front of kids. But a great quote from an educator who said that no matter what your district is doing, nobody's handing out printers, which is amazing. I was like, you are so right. So we have to just kind of accept those new resource limitations of the home environment. And so we are full course press right now developing new digital formats for a lot of our offline materials that we're hoping are going to make them more flexible, more accessible, both during this kind of weird time and also long-term in lower resource environments. So it's kind of a win-win long-term and short-term.
Kind of ironic, right, that we would go more digital to serve higher need students. That's an interesting kind of
phones.
Yeah,
the chat has really talked a lot about this, but phones are the big thing.
Yeah,
all over the place.
Yeah, no, for students from students from minoritized backgrounds. I mean, that's what smartphones are, what people have. That's what they have, and that's what they use for lots and lots of things. Yeah. All right, Amanda, I think you're next.
I thought I was next, but okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, Kim.
I have grave concerns about the future of public education right now because of the inequities and the things that I'm seeing going on with the families with means and creating their private learning pods and opting out of public education. And I mean, we're looking at a very serious time for the future of bridging the gap, not only with achievement, but with social inequity and widening it. And I'm really concerned that this, if we don't intervene as educators and as people who support educators, that gap will get even bigger and society will suffer for it. And so I feel like there's a real moral imperative behind all of this. And so what we need to do is to really simplify, because there are too many, I mean, there really are too many options out there. You can log on this way, you can log on that way. I mean, it almost needs to be like, click this one button and get online and like remove all of the different barriers. Because I've heard from parents who are highly educated, engineers, who are saying, I don't know how to get on the learning platform that my kid is supposed to be on. So think about students who come from families who don't have that educational background, or parents are working 2 or 3 jobs. And so I feel like that I just want to make sure that whatever we do it with that lens of equity, to make sure that we're not participating in greater divides in our society, in our country, that I think are being exacerbated already with COVID, and the people the essential workers having to go to work, and the kids who are in those families. And it's just, it's really troubling to me. And so part of my work as a consultant now is to create that accessibility and make sure that, and I actually had a business reach out to me just the other day saying, we want to hire you to consult with our families to make sure that they're figuring out how to manage the children's education, because employees, most of them have children. And so I thought that was a really wonderful approach from a company saying, we care about our employees and their families. Can you help them navigate this world? And so, but it shouldn't be a pay to play situation. It really shouldn't be.
My turn or Amanda? Can't remember. Go. Yeah, I'd like to like and +1 the gravity that Kim just spoke to, because we're watching it play out in real time right now. I think just at the most basic level, speaking of Maslow, things like meal, food security, supplies, safety. School used to be the safest place for some of our kids. Our homeless youth, we're very concerned about a lot of issues going on there. And then of course, access to devices and the internet as well. We also have populations that we're being very focused on and targeting for additional attention, particularly our migrant center, where our migrant families and students are in a very rural location. So we have to be mindful around what types of cell coverage and then the compatible hotspots to make sure that they have access. There's a lot of micro solutions that we have to attend to in a large organization in order to address the inequities. But the ones that we're really keen to and watching closely, and even internally starting to drum up policy around, are things like these learning pods, where families with means and privileges are going to continue to exacerbate the opportunity gap that our students are facing. We have been collecting data as well internally through surveys and so forth, disaggregating them by race, socioeconomic status, and so forth, and are seeing disproportionality in the experience of our families. So that helps us direct our attention. On an optimistic note, however, I think there are 3 kind of ways we think about it. One is that as public educators, there is a strong and positive collective responsiveness right now to the broader national social justice movement. And so we're promoting that. And particularly with ethnic studies in California, there's a lot in the cultural context and the policy context that helps build the momentum towards doing the right thing to support our students who are furthest from opportunity. Second, like I said about professional development, we have so much time now that we've been able to bake in for PD that is our opportunity to also build the capacity of our teachers around their equity lens as well as culturally responsive teaching. And so we're being super intentional about making sure that that's a part of the work. And then three, we just got a ton of money from the state. It's quick, it's short, but our budget is a statement of our values, and we're putting our money where our mouth is to make sure, again, that our students furthest from opportunity are benefiting from it.
I'll just be short. I think a lot has already been said. That's really great. So, just doing the research reports that we're trying to put out, to highlight inequity in terms of how this was, how this played out for different income brackets in spring remote learning is kind of the way that we are trying to help, and hoping that, informs people in the fall what we should be keeping track of and reminding ourselves on. And I think a lot of schools are already taking a lot of action around there. We've seen a lot of reports of schools that were struggling to get devices out in the spring have gotten quick grants and are helping to get one-to-one on computers for their students. So yeah, that's it.
Great. So we're getting close. Thank you very much, Amanda. Thank you everyone for your comments. We're getting pretty close to time. Maybe we could have just one quick comment, maybe from each of you, about any recommendations. Many people in our audience are people that are doing learning analytics, hence Baylan, right? Or people involved in analytics, working within research or ed tech organizations. If you had, again, briefly, one thing that you would recommend that people keep in mind or begin to look at, what is that thing that you might suggest? And again, I'm gonna, and maybe we'll go, and I'm gonna give people from the educational institutions the first things to say maybe. So maybe we'll go Roddy, Kim, Jamie, actually, Roddy, Kim, Amanda, because you can't be last again, Jamie, Libby, and I'm gonna write it down so I don't forget it.
Just one thing, John, I have so much to ask for from now to open it up.
Sorry.
I'll keep it quick. I think at a high level that, this is a novel environment, and we're struggling to get our heads wrapped around how we promote a deep and meaningful learning. How do we track engagement? How do we, formatively assess? How do we allow students to engage much more dynamically and organically and provide the data to teachers in real time so that they can adjust and modify their instruction accordingly to really support learners. So that's not very specific, but if they're, as artificial intelligence and your worlds continue to evolve in super sophisticated ways, how does that undergird more rigorous and deeper instruction? And in that work, in an ideal world, it'd be great that the data and the analytics that come from that are so powerful and so profound that we continue to use these best practices when COVID is over. We do not want to go back. This is, in some ways I can't contain my excitement about the pandemic because of all the changes that are ahead of us in a progressive way. But if analytics and data can support shifts in teacher behavior and deeper instruction, that'd be fantastic.
I totally agree with what Roddy said, but I also want to add that to not forget the human element. And we all love data. We wouldn't be here unless we were data geeks in one way, shape, or form and believe that data is really important. But if you gather data and you don't act on it, then it's worthless. And also that there are people behind the data. And so to look at students as numbers and to look at charts and graphs, those are all really important. But I also believe that drilling down and the story behind it, that we're complex human beings and the data doesn't always show really who we are and what we're learning and what's important. And so what Roddy was saying earlier about just those numbers being one thing, but the metrics need to be deeper than that, because clicks and logons and those numeric things don't necessarily tell you about engagement and true deep learning and long-lasting learning. And so I know it's a tall order, but it's one that we have to consider, because otherwise the data doesn't actually tell you what's happening in the lives of these children and in the lives of the teachers.
Yeah, I'm going to add in just supplementing a qualitative aspect to make sure we can contextualize and understand it, I think is really important. I do think we can use clicks to model active engagement versus passive engagement, or people who are disaffected and things like that. We're kind of doing that work. So I don't want to belittle the data that and some of the insights they can give us as well. So just wanted to mention that. So, but it's not my time to talk though. Let's go on.
No, but I kind of along what you guys are saying there, some of the things that have been really helpful for me, and it's kind of exactly what you guys are saying, is that my, kind of as head of my group or department, it's not just about the data. It's like my job is also turned into read every single research report that comes out, read every single news article that might have some insight into this school district decided to do this instead, and how they kind of like, they're basically doing a lot of research for me. And then I'm like, great, thanks for this article, Wall Street Journal. I really appreciate that. Yeah. And then exactly what you're saying, we are pairing this also with, we're doing heavy research, user research right now. We basically have a head of user research that has talked to a bunch of students, and this kind of goes along, to some of the question I see in the QA. It's about like how we figured out want to make students want to learn. That's something that we kind of like talked about with students, is like, for those that stopped using Quizlet, why, and they just didn't have the motivation anymore. So kind of like pairing it with lots of other research, plus, talking to users. And the other thing is just like, we've been talking to parents a lot, finding out what that experience is like for them and kind of what we can do differently. So my job has become a lot more, it's like there's aggregate stuff to it, but it's become a lot more about talking to individuals more than I ever have in my job prior to this, which has been really interesting and exciting to kind of have that people element there.
Neat.
I think it's me, right?
I think so.
I can't say it better than the three of you just said it. I echo everything you just said. So I will take a little bit of a slant because John just said no high stakes tests. And I'll say that I think this is an incredibly interesting moment for learning analytics, because we're not going to be able to deploy assessments in the way that we're used to deploying them, which is in these really controlled environments at schools with like very specific testing periods. And I think that, kind of echoing Roddy's point, like one of the big questions is, are they learning? Not just are they logging in, not just are they using the program for 60 minutes a week or whatever the number is, or even are they making progress, but are they learning? Are they learning in deep and transferable ways? Are they learning for the long term? And it's a huge question of could potentially learning analytics help us answer those questions? Since students are already using those programs, could we monitor the way they are learning and know that they are in fact learning? So huge opportunity area, I think.
Yeah, with not as clear outcome measures. All right.
Yep.
Huge plus to all of that. I guess two things, and they're a little repetitive, but I think worth just emphasizing what you all have said. If you're an analyst yourself, talk to teachers. I've had a 30-minute conversation with the teachers shed more light than a month-long analysis, and they're going to get you to the why of the what that you found in the data. And I think there's opportunity for us in the industry to have more collaboration among learning analysts, especially going forward when our typical outcome measures of standardized test improvement year over year don't mean what they used to mean. So can we learn from each other? And then can we have a better feedback loop with schools? So from our analysis, we might be able to find best practices that lead to better whatever we've defined as a learning metric, and can we share that with schools, and can they share back with us, so that these research and these questions are happening less in isolation and more together.
That's great. I think what's interesting to me is also to reflect on that teachers may actually want to talk to us now more than they might have before, since they can't actually see their students in person, that we can kind of be proxies as well with the data that we have access to, and that help with interpretation. And I think to Kevin Kelly's point as well, that talking to students as much as we can as well, teachers and students, to kind of get that more rounded out sense of what the data we think it's telling us, into those inferences that we can get. there's been a lot of questions that have come through. Maybe we'll take, I do want to have at least a couple minutes for a break. I think I'm doing a poor job at navigating time, so apologies to that. And I really want to have questions, but I think I'm gonna pause now. So why don't we take a quick 5-minute break? Keeping people on Zoom for 4 hours is something I would like to be known for, less than not allowing enough questions. So let's I want to give a thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you for your insights, and thank you for your experience, and for all you're doing to help education continue and to keep education going in the face of COVID. So thank you very much for taking your time to prepare your remarks and presentations today. And we'll come back. So thank you very much. We'll restart in 5 minutes with the higher ed session.
Thanks, John.
Those of you that have held on, thank you for staying on. You know this is a long session. So I'm gonna back out a little bit from the slides here. Oh, we did have a break time slide. Look at that. So I think that we want to begin. Hopefully we've got all the people on. So we're going to begin back again. Let me share my screen with a series of presentations. I am going to do a quick round of introductions to who they are and a little bit about what they'll be presenting on. So we're going to have 3 presentations for this session, discussing the experience and the responses to higher education in the face of the pandemic and the emergency onlining that we've been experiencing. First, Ian Harlow, the Vice President for Science at Cerigo, is going to speak about their experience on the Cerigo platform and how they've been measuring the learning that happens and the changes. The next, we're going to hear about some research from Vanessa Peters and Julie Neisler at Digital Promise. They're going to speak to some feedback they received from students by doing some surveys. I believe it was a national survey, in particular around online course experiences and equity, and thinking about improving equity. And then finally, we're going to hear from Kevin Kelly and Inger Stark. Kevin's a lecturer at San Francisco State and a higher education consultant. And Inger is the distance education coordinator at the Peralta Community College District. And they've been working for a long time on how to improve equity in online courses, and then rolling out, there's a research-based rubric that they've been implementing, and talk about those experiences, improving equity in online course design. So that's what we have, and then we'll be following that, have a QA if we can keep the time, and then go into a panel session after that. So Ian, are you here? Are you not a Leanne and able to share?
I'm here, and I think I should be able to share.
All right.
Okay.
Yep.
You all see my slides okay?
Looks great.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you, John, for having me. My name is Ian Harlow. I'm a former memory scientist, now works at Cerigo, as you say. I'm the VP of Science there, so I cover the kind of learning science and data science. And Cerigo is an adaptive learning company. So we help people learn more effectively and more efficiently. We use learning science to do so. And we supplement it with machine learning and all that good stuff. And our core aim is to help you retain more of the stuff that you learn through Cerigo. So most of what we learn or see or experience, like most of the stuff you'll see in this really interesting set of sessions, you'll forget pretty quickly afterwards. That's just the way the brain works. But learning science has given us a lot of good ways to help you build knowledge and retention that will actually stick around and be useful and transferable. So that's what Cerigo is trying to do and implement for people. Oops. I'll just give you a quick diversion into some of the patterns that we've seen to kind of, sit alongside some of the other providers that have been talking in the K-12 session. Overall on Cerigo, so I just looked at a set of courses and partners that we have that should be pretty consistent year over year to try and get a sense of what the sort of disruption has done. And these are mostly higher education, sort of college age students for context. And just looking at the last 3 months, just April, June, spring session this year compared to the same time period last year, we've actually seen more unique users on the platform. We did see a very stark drop in mid-March, like a lot of other people did, but by the later sessions, we saw more, essentially more of the people who have a seat or have access to Cerigo are using it as a tool. And actually, even though we had more users, those users were also engaged more frequently. So it wasn't just a sort of increase in part-time users. People were actually doing more sessions, engaged in more days, which is very important for learning. But they were doing it for shorter sessions, so they weren't spending as long learning in each session or as long sitting in front of the screen. That's kind of broadly what we saw. An interesting pattern, though, is when people were actually learning. So we saw pretty dramatic changes in what time of day people engaged with our platform. We saw big increases in activity at night, quite late at night, so 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. Big decreases in the activity that we normally see in the mornings that, you know, is probably correlated with commutes and early classes, and a pretty substantial uptick in the afternoon. So essentially students are taking their learning on Cerigo and that activity and shifting it later in the day. That's the main effect that we see. The sort of peak time is shifted from 11 or 12 o'clock to 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then we're also seeing this big spike in activity during the nighttime. So this chart is showing you relative change in when people are actually engaging with our app. And that's really interesting, right? So these patterns could be good or bad, and it's kind of too early to tell. They could, of course, just reflect, you know, great disruption in student lives, having to, you know, look after sick relatives and disruption of having to look after kids and things like that. And certainly when we've looked at data in the past, we find accuracy tends to be worse under these circumstances. These are bad circumstances under which to do a test or an exam, for example. When you're doing short, frequent sessions that are sort of mixed in with other things, especially if it's late at night. But conversely, and anyone who's kind of into learning science will recognize this, learning is actually better under those circumstances. So we often see the effectiveness of some activity on your learning, your long-term retention for material that we can measure later on. That often goes in a different direction to accuracy in the moment. So often you'll struggle, get questions wrong right now. That can often actually be the point at which you're learning the most and getting the most benefit for your minutes spent learning. So it's kind of tough to conclude. Some of these patterns look like they're actually shifting towards a healthier mode of learning. And we really need to know some of the outcomes and track them over time to see if that's the case. And so that reflects something that is important, I think everybody here recognizes, which is that anyone involved in providing education, whether you're an educator or an institution or a tool provider, we all have an obligation to measure learning accurately. So when I talk about measuring remote learning, I'm not really talking about grading students and telling you, you know, you're 5th in the class versus 20th in the class, you're getting a B, you're getting a D. What I'm talking about more is a kind of KPI for us as education providers. Like, are people actually learning the things that we want them to learn? Is that effective? And obviously that's something that is hard to measure right now because everything's shifted and changed and we have to kind of get a grip of that. And I heard, I think it was Jamie in the first session, describe it for instructors and sort of educators as being like having a blindfold suddenly, and that rang really true. It fits a lot with what we've seen in this survey that we conducted recently, where, you know, as you might expect, almost all of the educators we asked, it's mostly higher education educators, are conducting their assessments remotely now. And that's about double what they were before COVID-19. So that was only about half of them were doing so before this change. Perhaps more interestingly or surprisingly, as many as a third of them cited testing, quizzing, and assessment as being the or one of the most challenging aspects of moving to remote teaching. And so the only other thing that was rated more challenging by this cohort was, you know, student engagement, as we've talked about, which is really obviously very key. And this just kind of fits with the instructors that I've spoken to in person or follow on Twitter, and it's very consistent with what instructors tend to want, which is, I want to know that I'm reaching my students. I want to know that they're there. I want to know that they're engaged, and I want to know that they're actually learning the thing that I want to learn and coming away with the value that I'm trying to provide them. And right now, it's really hard to tell that. And so traditionally, you know, as we've talked about, and as I noticed that the previous very interesting panel session sort of hit on at the end, traditionally we use moment in time testing, kind of high stakes exams and tests. That's the default way to assess learning, knowledge, understanding. It's interesting to kind of think about why that is the case. One reason, of course, is that it's easy to administer and grade even in the absence of computers. And so that means we've been using it for a long time. It's also very familiar, and it's important, I think, to recognize that there's a little bit of a social bias here in that most of us who are, on this conference, not exclusively, but most of us will be here because we've done relatively well out of the higher education system as it is currently set up. And you can't really do very well out of the current higher education system without being pretty good at exams, right? We might find it tough, but relative to the average person, we've probably been able to cope with exams and moment in time testing better than average. And that's a problem, right? Because we know that exams are not unbiased. We know that there are persistent and worrying correlations with race and ethnicity, things like family income. There are also correlations that are maybe less visible, but possibly just as important, right? So 1 in 4 high school students suffer from severe chronic test anxiety. And what I mean by that is not the kind of nervousness that you get before presenting or exam. Most of us, 2/3 to 3/4 of us experience that and find exams stressful. I'm talking about a persistent underperformance in those conditions relative to what you would measure through other ways of assessing them. And that's a very, very large proportion of people who are particularly ill-served by an education system that relies on exams and high-stakes moment-in-time testing. On top of that, exams have pretty limited predictive power. It's a snapshot in time. It's a snapshot of some subset of concepts or questions that you're asking. It's just for practical reasons, always going to be limited, and there's a lot left there up to chance, how healthy you are on the day, how awake, what your family circumstances are, what questions in particular get asked. That means it has some limit to how predictive it actually is, and we've measured that quantitatively. The other big thing is it's very, very difficult, especially now we're going remote, to distinguish a good exam score because of deep understanding from a good exam score because you crammed the night before and got all that information temporarily fresh in your head, or you just have access to the information through something else, you have some external help. It's really difficult to kind of distinguish those things with exams and high stakes testing. So it's worth thinking about whether it's really kind of fit for purpose and measuring the things we want to measure. So I'll give you an example of another way of measuring learning that we use at Cerego. This is the kind of primary outcome measure at Cerego. We try to use something that's a little bit more scientifically grounded, and we use something called knowledge retention. And it's a parameter that comes from pretty standard learning and memory models. So, we use the testing effect and distributed learning. You come back and you review over time until you've built up memories that actually kind of last a long time, that stick in your long-term memory. And we can measure that memory stability at the individual memory level, which we call retention. So how well has that concept kind of transferred to your long-term memory? How long will you have access to that information? If we ask you that question in 3 months, are you likely to be able to retrieve that from your memory? It's useful because we can calculate that and track that for every concept across multiple interactions. So now it's no longer a moment in time high stakes thing. We're building that from every interaction you have on our platform. And it turns out that very, very consistently, it's much more predictive of future outcomes than a test or an exam. Test or an exam is just not forward looking. It's not trying to predict what are you going to score on some date in the future, whereas this metric is actually trying to predict that. So it's inherently carries more information about that. It's not surprising that it's more predictive. I'll give you a quick example of that just to make that more concrete. This is a peer-reviewed, sort of publicly available bit of research if you want to follow up on it. But at the University of Hawaii in Manoa, we actually got access to the exam scores split into the multiple choice section and sort of more open-ended 10-point analysis understanding questions that are designed to really kind of tease apart, did someone really learn and understand the materials for a macroeconomics course. We found, as you might expect, that better retention that people built using Cerego did predict better overall exam performance. It predicted better performance on the multiple choice questions. Interestingly, it predicted better performance on the analysis questions to a stronger degree. And in fact, it predicted how well you did on those analysis questions, even after you controlled for multiple choice performance in the same exam, a few minutes earlier. So it is a powerful tool. It is a scientifically grounded approach to measuring memory that has a lot of advantages over exams. So I will leave you with this. I'd say there is an opportunity here. I think even before going remote, exams are an imperfect way to measure learning remotely. I think we all know that. Cognitive science does give us measures such as, retention is one of these that are robust, that are meaningful, that we can calculate right now, and that have a lot of advantages over exams. So I think there's a good argument we should be moving towards those.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Ian. That was really interesting, and I think a number of interesting findings. Look forward to following up with. Julie or Vanessa, are you ready to step in?
We are ready.
All right.
Vanessa, are you here?
Yep, at least her picture is.
Okay, so I'm going to kick us off. My name is Julie Neisler. I'm a quantitative researcher / data scientist at an education nonprofit, Digital Promise. They're in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is how I got connected to this amazing group. And so we're going to talk about a survey that we conducted in late spring, nationally representative survey of college students, just to get a snapshot and an understanding of what were their experiences transitioning to online. And then what did equity look like for them? Because we know we have this triage moment of where we send all these students home, and then what happened. So I'll let Vanessa introduce herself.
Vanessa, you're muted if you're speaking.
Vanessa.
I was speaking. Thank you. Yeah, so my name's Vanessa Peters. I'm also a Digital Promise, where I'm a senior learning sizes researcher with Jeremy Rochelle and others. I believe he may be on this call. So I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about the study, just sharing the methods. We administered a national survey. It was a random sample survey of more than 1,000 college students whose coursework moved from in-person to completely online after COVID. So included students from both 2- and 4-year institutions, although there was, I think, about 3/4 more of the students were actually from 4 years. And the questions asked students about their course experiences before and after COVID, including what they missed the most about their face-to-face courses, the challenges they faced, and how their learning was impacted from remote learning. And then we also conducted some interviews and focus groups with 92 students, and that provided a lot of insight into how students were thinking, about their courses, what their challenges were, a lot of reasons for lack of motivation, aspects of the way their lectures were delivered. So I'm going to share a little bit about that with you as we progress through the presentation.
So as you may all expect, their overall satisfaction with the courses dropped after transitioning to online for COVID courses. We saw a pretty steep drop from, we asked their satisfaction before and then after, but we didn't really see differences between types of institutions. So we looked at if satisfaction dropped differently for students at 4-year institutions, 2-year, public or private. We also looked at disaggregated students by income level and gender, and didn't see differences. So it was pretty much a holistic drop across the board for everybody. But so then we dove into a little bit about, okay, so your satisfaction dropped, but what contributed to that? So we asked about 4 different things: instructor preparation, quality of course content, quality of instruction, and your learning overall. And of these 4, learning overall had the strongest correlation with their satisfaction in the course after COVID. And so we really see that, they appreciated how hard their instructors work, and they said, we're all in this together, we are struggling, we have a week to do this. The course content didn't really change too much. Instructors tended to get better over time or stay the same when they transitioned to online. But students talked about how they really struggled with their learning, and knowing that these were often like larger gateway courses that they had to continue on in these, STEM courses, really impacted how satisfied they felt about the course overall.
All right, so the survey also asked students about specific aspects of their course experiences. So understanding what was expected of you in the course. 35% thought it was worse online. And I can tell you from interviews with students that students who were using technology quite systematically in their course before COVID had many more positive comments to say about their course. Students that had consistent assignments, one chemistry class, they took notes and handed them in with handouts before COVID. In the online version, they did the same type of activity with their lectures, and they had great things to say about their instructor and the transition process as well. Availability with help with course content. 42% thought it was worse online. That was also a big theme in the interviews. Students missed access to tutoring. They missed access to having their peers right there to ask questions, and they really missed having immediate feedback. So they really missed this something popped into their head and they wanted clarification. So that type of immediate feedback was a big factor for them. And keeping interested in the course content. So in the, we asked students, you know, what did you struggle with the most? And a lot of students put motivation, but then they went on to explain something a little bit more. And it often had to do with the format of the lectures of the video. So they weren't interested in course content because it was a 90-minute recorded audio with no visuals, go figure. But this actually happened for some of the students in the class. And so this is just an overview of the coding. So as I said, we did ask students, what is your biggest struggle post-COVID? Like, what was the thing you struggled with the most? And you can see focus distractions was a big one. And students had problems with, it could be anything from, you know, I wanted to watch Netflix to, you know, I had a family member, you know, maybe they were from, you know, multi-generational family, that was an issue. Keeping a scheduled time management, that was also a very big theme. Students missed having to show up on campus and being in this academic environment with other students who were there for the same person. They missed having that 2-hour, you know, blocking between two courses where they knew that's when I'll do my homework. So translating a schedule, you know, into online home environment was a real problem for a lot of students. Difficult learning material. A lot of students talked about having to teach myself or learn it on my own. They didn't feel like they were connected, and this really impacted their learning. COVID-related challenges, some students did mention, you know, it's hard to be interested in biology like when this is happening out in the world. I mentioned immediate feedback already. Direct help. Students wanted one-to-one help with either instructor or from a peer. You know, they wanted immediate feedback and just someone showing them how to do something. Fewer students had tech issues, connections with the internet problems. A student who had to go, gosh, she had to watch her course videos in the bathroom because that's the only way where her internet connection worked. They mentioned tech issues that the instructor had. In some cases, you know, he couldn't get the audio working and he walked away, and, you know, they were pinging him and he wasn't responding. Some students commented on changes to assessment and grading. In some cases, they were positive. An instructor might say, okay, out of the 4 tests, you can drop the lowest score. You know, we'll make that adjustment. And of course, any student who had a lab or practical clinical experience that suffered greatly once the course had transitioned to online.
Yeah, I want to speak to what Kevin's comment about many higher ed instructors were maybe unfamiliar with teaching online. We talked to some of our institutions and they said up to 1/3 of our faculty have not even logged into their LMS system as of spring break. So you had several institutions who already had these course shells built in online LMS systems, whether that be Blackboard or Canvas, but there were also, you know, tended to be older faculty who said, you know, I don't really know what I'm doing, and like, what's a doc cam, and what do I do with this? And so we think this group may be necessarily more familiar with tech, but and I want to feel like that's bimodal, right? So you have some people who have been in this for a while and some instructors who are like, I'm never teaching online and this is horrible, versus some who are pretty tech savvy and picked it up pretty quickly. Where's the cry button? I have no idea. So then we asked about the instructional practices, right? Because there was this almost big divide that we felt between synchronous instruction and asynchronous instruction. And I know that K through 12 struggled with this too and talked about it earlier. But so many students said, I show up and I want to have a Zoom class at the same time that my class was. And so many instructors, about 2/3, had live sections where students could ask questions, or live lectures by the instructors with the class watching in real time. But we also had talked to many instructors who said, I'm worried about my students' responsibilities. And, you know, many of the students that we heard from said, I now have to take care of my younger children because they are in K through 12 and they're home and I have to tutor them. We heard stories from students who, you know, my parents were laid off and now I work at a grocery store and I'm the primary earner for my family. And so they really appreciated those asynchronous course lessons. So recorded lectures, not as much referring to those pre-recorded videos from external sources, a little over half, but it was much more frequently that instructors were either giving live classes and having people show up, or recording themselves and then putting that lecture online.
And I'll just chime in, Julie, with the previous slide. Students who are taking courses asynchronously like that because it contributes to their sense of having a schedule and knowing what to do when. But on the other hand, with time zone issues, it was a problem for some students. So, and also with respect to, you know, having how the lecture was recorded, students really enjoyed seeing their instructor's face. That was a big impact for them, being able to connect and have their, you know, their own instructor giving a lecture rather than watching something, you know, from Khan Academy or YouTube.
Yeah. To answer one of the many Leanne's questions about efficacy of live versus asynchronous, we are still looking into that. I think it depended more on the student and what the student was struggling with and the other things they had to contend with. Though like their major struggles tended to play much more role in their learning overall than the, you know, mode of instruction. So then earlier we, talked about these instructional practices. So these are best practices recommended research about efficacy that are the most common supported instructional practices in online education. So as you can see, there was a various implementation of doing these by instructors. So I think Roddy earlier talked about, oh, they booked a contract with Microsoft Teams because they could do breakout rooms. And so instructors, despite saying that they really like that, they really like that small group and being able to talk to students, when many of our students in higher education, especially these gateway courses, have 75, 200, 300 students, that's not really possible. So that was not something that occurred very frequently. Also, assignments to work on group projects was not as common. It was very much this individual of I put up a video where I teach and then you learn, and not as much group work. But we did see lots of instructors using frequent quizzes or other assessments to sort of gauge how their students were learning. And then instructors using example from the real world to illustrate course content. And so one of the things we looked at was any one instructional practice connected more to satisfaction overall. And so we found a couple. So the instructor sending personal messages, a little over half did that. That was really more associated with motivation. So students who felt like their instructor was reaching out to them, they're more likely to be motivated. And then using those real world examples really helped them connect with the material more and be more satisfied with the course. Some of our STEM courses talked about how this was almost a field day of talking about what are viruses and biology, what does that mean, and how do we talk about transfer and R-naught and how applicable those things were to the real world. But the biggest finding that we found was it was less about which instructional practices, but more the frequency of instructional practices. So if an instructor only did one or two of those items, students were less likely to be overall satisfied than if an instructor was using more of them. So whether it was, doing breakout rooms, if a student showed up to a class, or doing a project, and plus those personal messages, plus using real world examples. So the more frequent number of instructional practices, the overall satisfied that they were. And we didn't really get deeper into the efficacy and frequency of those instructional practices. We partnered with Titan Research Partners, and so they did a survey to instructors, sort of get in depth about what did that look like for them. So we're not really sure if one personal message made the difference versus consistent personal messages, but just knowing that varying up your instructional practices and taking advantage of those tech tools that allow you to do all these things really played overall to satisfaction. Equitable learning, I'm gonna wrap up pretty quickly, but as we know, students really struggled with being online and getting connected to the internet, devices. Things like women of color were significantly more likely to be in charge of childcare, and then struggling with their home and family responsibilities. And if you want the survey, here's the link, and I'm being told to wrap up. So thank you all.
Great. Thank you very much, Julie and Vanessa, and sorry for being the time cop.
No, that's okay. I'm going to fess up. We actually inserted a few more slides a little earlier in the day because I thought, gee, ours looks a little bit short. Maybe we could, she could expand on a few things. But anyway,
Yeah.
Thank you for the extra minute.
No worries. And no, it's fascinating. There's a lot of really good stuff there, I think, especially seeing the scale and scope of that. Nice to hear about student responses as well. So thank you very much. There that is. All right. So Inger and Kevin, we're ready to hand it over to you.
Fantastic. and tough acts to follow, Julie and Vanessa and Ian. So thanks for setting the stage. And because we are not a nationwide effort, we're a more local to kind of coincide with the global. Trying to figure out why my. There's the study.
Kim figured this out earlier. I think the pull down menu, the file pull down, you go over to.
No, I clicked the present button, but then it disappeared and grayed out. So I'm gonna stop sharing while I.
I could just talk about something, Kevin, if you want.
Please. Well, I mean, why don't you give context of the Peralta district while I figure out why this is.
So my name is Inger Stark, and the conference information, no fault of John's, says that I'm the distance ed coordinator. I've actually been the distance ed coordinator at the Peralta Community College District centered in Oakland for 4 years. But beginning last Monday, I switched roles, and I'm now the professional development coordinator at the district. So. And we began a relationship with Kevin Kelly, who's a higher ed consultant, about 4 years ago. And what we're going to tell you just sort of a little story about an initiative at our district and try to tell you the micro version of the story, but contextualize it also within some of the comments made by the other presenters, Ian, and the research by Julie and Vanessa. I was so excited to hear what you were talking about, because one of the points we're going to make down the road is that we really struggled to find research that was relevant and helped us set up our project. And the research you just did would be incredibly valuable as we go forward. So.
Yay.
There we go.
Like back to Kevin.
There we go. So just for those of you who are not familiar, since this is Baylan, we wanted to situate ourselves in the Bay context. Peralta Community College District, or Peralta Colleges, is spread around Oakland, Alameda, and Berkeley, and serves more than 30,000 students and a very diverse student body. I was so proud and excited to join this project, and it got kicked off actually when Inger went on sabbatical and did some data analysis related to success. And here's a graphic from the California Community College system-wide distance education report from a couple of years ago. And what's interesting is that they were pointing out how the difference between success in distance education courses is reaching parity over time with traditional face-to-face success, students passing those classes after staying in them. And we'll talk at a different conference about why the traditional face-to-face success rate never changed during that entire period. But what's something that emerged from the data that Inger was looking at was that if you look beyond the average and start disaggregating the data according to different groups, you see that there are some disparities, some what we call educational debt gaps, because sometimes people are calling them achievement gaps, but that puts the onus on students when it may be an institutional barrier, an instructor bias, or an instructor assumption that's leading to that, that educational debt. So this led us to the project that we're going to describe for you here. And what's interesting here, we also want to mention, is that this graphic is before COVID-19 hit, and a lot of these equity issues that we'll talk about have been amplified, as many of the speakers have said, due to COVID, due to access to technology, but also to access to resources and people, and feeling of connectedness and belonging, all of those things that we'll talk about in our rubric. If you look in a dictionary, equity is defined very simply as freedom from bias, but the distance education team at Peralta expanded on that definition and uses the term to mean freedom from biases, assumptions, or institutional barriers that negatively impact online learners' motivations, opportunities, or accomplishments. And I think, again, that speaks to the difference between achievement gaps and educational debt. Because we wanted to do research-based project, some of the identification of those different groups of students, whether they be disproportionately impacted students or minoritized students, that whatever terms you use. And there is some research out there, Shauna Smith-Jaggers and Dee Shu. They've identified certain groups like ethnic minority students, like we saw in the slides earlier, the Hispanic/Latinx students and Black African American students have been below, succeeding at below average rates. Males also tend to do less well in online courses in college. First generation students, low income students, and academically underprepared students were identified in those two studies by Jaggers and Shu and Jaggers. You'll notice that some of the terms are italicized, and that's because the first two bullets really are the only ones that are easy to get data for. In a student information system in a higher education institution, a lot of the fields are not filled in for every student. So then you are not able to do the same level of analytics work for every group. And we've added some bullets based on our project: LGBTQ students, working adults, students with disabilities, and others that we may not even have considered yet are also groups that face barriers in online learning environments. So the nutshell version of our story, as Inger described it, and I love the fact that some of the speakers in the previous groups said, hey, you need to have the humans to counterbalance the data. You need to have the stories to go along with it. So based on Inger's work, we started doing some training related to a learning management system change and conducted some needs assessments around the same time of both faculty and students to identify challenges and how students were using resources around the district. That led to the first ever strategic plan for distance education at the district level. And one of the core values that we added to that plan, based on the values of the people on the distance education committee and the district itself, was equity. The other one was the learners themselves. So between those two core values, we said we can't just have a plan sitting on a shelf with these values in them, we have to live those values. And so we went out looking for ways to help instructors teaching distance education courses, whether they be online or hybrid, to infuse equity, learning equity into their course, or increase learning equity for their students. What we found was that there were no instruments out there. There were some great work done by groups like University of Southern California's Center for Urban Education and others, but there weren't many tools that were directly applicable for online instructors. So we decided to create our own. And we also decided that it needed to be research-based. So we went out and did research about what aspects of online courses increase equity issues and what interventions actually reverse the trend or help students succeed in those conditions. And so once we created that rubric, it was important to create a training around it, the online equity training, to help faculty members use the different criteria in their courses. And that led to more and more work, all the way up to what now is called the Online Equity Initiative at the district. And what's interesting to note is that while this started as a distance education initiative, the faculty members teaching face-to-face courses, when those are possible again, have found that they can use this rubric to support their instruction in those classes as well. So the rubric itself, again, you can see the rates of students who are passing the face-to-face classes and online classes. And so some of those are based on different institutions. The numbers are much lower in the online space. And we're not quite sure how well this equity rubric is going to remediate that challenge. And so that's something that we're going to discuss at the end of our session, our future research plans. So that rubric that we've been describing is, again, based on research. It's meant to be used in conjunction with a course design rubric designed by the California Virtual Campus Online Education Initiative, which has training for faculty around the system, 114 colleges, to address the quality and accessibility for students with disabilities of their online courses. So when you get a chance to look at the rubric, you'll see that it begins as section E, as in equity. And that is because the CVC OEI rubric has sections A through D. So we built it with the intention that it would be used in conjunction with that other course design rubric, not to compete with it. And we wanted to apply this to all aspects of the student experience. And so what we'll see when we look at the criteria is many of folks on this in this conference have talked about the access issues that are inherent. Not only do they maybe not have access to devices because they're sharing them in a household with working adults and other students, or they may not have the devices in the first place, and they may be using smartphones or landline phones to complete their work. But they also need access to campus resources that may be hidden when everything is closed and it has to be found via online or phone-based pathways. We wanted to make sure that universal design for learning became an aspect of the course design, diversity and inclusion, the use of images and media and how different groups of students are represented in the course materials and activities, managing different biases that we may have, making sure that students find meaning in the course topics, and helping students find a sense of connection with their peers and a sense of belonging. So I'll hand it over to Ingrid to talk a little bit more about the rubric, the criteria, the ratings, and more.
Actually, John, can we do a quick time check? We can go fast and hover only at 40,000 feet to be done quicker. I'm super excited about the Q&A, and I'm very excited about the panel. What's your feeling on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we had it going until just about now. I think we were a couple minutes. So, I mean, I think another 2 or 3 minutes would be great, and maybe highlighting some of the components you think are the most important and maybe most relevant under the COVID conditions would be great.
Okay, Kevin, why don't you go ahead and advance to the table, actually, through the way we actually rolled the project out and some of the strengths, and go to the table that has the strengths and weaknesses. So, so a couple of things. We rolled out a project at the district. We've developed workshops, the online equity training, which is where faculty come in and take a 5-week session. They learn how to use the criteria and the rubric in reworking their pedagogy. At the same time, Kevin is helping us to do a pilot study, and he's going to tell you about that in a minute. But I did want to point out a couple of things about the challenges and the strengths in our initiative. And one is that for those of you who work with instructors, whether it's through ed tech or at educational institutions, you probably already know this, that one of our biggest impediments and hurdles is the time investment in instructional redesign. Any instructional redesign is difficult, but doing it with the criteria that we set up is huge. And that burden became immensely more difficult under the, the changing things that happened as a result of the COVID crisis. Again, as Kevin pointed out, we weren't able to really find a lot of stuff that we found helpful, research that we found helpful that talked about the experiences of minoritized background students in online learning specifically. Lots about students in face-to-face environments, but not a lot of research about students in online environments. We also have been struggling to get institutional support at our own institution. And one of our biggest impediments has been the institutional and cultural resistance to centering equity. And the short version of that just is that no matter what we do, we have a hard time putting that at the center. I told the panelists the story when we were prepping for this about talking to some ed tech specialists saying, you're the geniuses of technology. Can't you help us center equity by actually thinking of ways to build it into technology and advancing how technology can actually serve the interest of centering equity? And then Kevin, you want to talk about the strengths in our research project?
Sure. Well, one of the biggest strengths, if you're familiar with the research out of Google, the most successful teams are the most diverse, and the equity team as a perfect example of that. We have representation of quite a few different groups, including not only in terms of race, ethnicity, age, but also life experience, status of what their role is in the district. We had somebody from the tech help desk, the learning management system administrator, all who provided valuable information and ideas to support the development of the rubric. The participation by the faculty in the training and using the rubric to redesign their course has been exceedingly positive. We're finding with the stories that those faculty members are saying, hey, I haven't even finished revising my course and I'm already getting feedback from students about how this is impacting their learning in a positive way. We have done a number of presentations about the rubric around the state and the country, and it's getting a lot of positive feedback and even won an award through the Online Learning Consortium. And finally, it adds value to the instructors who are teaching and increases a focus not only on equity, but pedagogy as well. So
I also just want to say that the team, the equity team at Peralta, the online equity team, literally became the situation room during the COVID crisis for our district, about how to support the district entirely to go from Friday to Monday to an entirely online teaching institution.
Well, and what's interesting is faculty members who went through the training said, I really don't have time for this, but I'm making time because it's so important to support my students. I know how equity is actually falling through the cracks in a lot of ways, and they wanted to make sure they were serving their students. So that props to the instructors at Peralta. So just as a way to close the loop, we are planning a research effort, and this is the more recent data compared to the graph you saw early in our presentation. We want to study the efficacy of, after you redesign your course based on the rubric and the training, how well does it impact the students themselves? And we want to look not only at the retention and success numbers like a chart like this, but we also want to take a look at the, talk to the students themselves and the faculty and hear their stories and find out what helped and what we still need to work on.
Yeah, and a call out, we've talked about including some learning analytics measures, which I think would be great and always good, as we heard previously, to talk to people, right? I like to make jokes around that, but it's also great to look at what they did and how they may have interacted and engaged differently. Seems like there's really the nexus for a fantastic study here, especially given the scale and scope, but also recognize that you actually got funding to not only create, you created the rubric, but then received funding to roll this out, right? And actually train as a professional development to train faculty. And I know that was not a COVID activity, that was pre-COVID as well, right? Great. I don't know that we have, does anyone have questions? I think there's a couple of questions that we've received. So thank you very much for Inger and Kevin. Thank you very much for taking and for sharing that presentation. I think that in your experience, I think we've actually had most questions from the chat and QA areas have been answered, is what I'm hearing from my colleagues who are monitoring that. Does anyone have any other questions, or can you speak up if you think that's different, or there are other questions people would like to have answered by any of the presenters? Give time for that awkward pause as we wait for people to.
I have a question for Ian. It was just that slide where you were showing when students were using the courseware time of day, it was later, and that was associated with higher accuracy, but lower learning, reduced learning. Could you say a little more about that?
Yeah, and actually in I'm very sorry, I have 2 children under the age of 3 who are making a lot of noise in the background, but I'll hopefully be able to speak over. Yeah, so there's a pattern that we see, and it was nicely covered actually in some of the responses in the little panelist discussion by some of the other panelists. There's a difference between accuracy in the moment, how well you're scoring on a test right now, and how much you're learning from that test, how much it's improving your long-term retention or understanding of that material. So it's very easy to kind of do a test, get 10 out of 10, feel good about it, but then find you've forgotten most of that information again, or you haven't gained much from doing that. It's critical, as this concept of desirable difficulty, to test yourself, and challenge yourself, kind of like exercising, you know, where you have to like push the limits a little bit to improve your abilities. And so we see that a lot in the data. We see a lot of the circumstances where you're finding things easier and you have more study fluency and you score higher on tests and exams, those are often the circumstances when you're actually learning less from every minute that you're spending doing that. It's a less efficient way to learn. And that's honestly, that's one of the challenges for kind of applying this kind of learning strategy to users, is that that's counterintuitive, right? People like to feel like they're getting questions right. That makes them feel like they're learning, feel like they understand the material, and actually in many cases the opposite is right. You want to be getting 6 out of 10. And
right. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, so Jen, thank you for jumping on. Jen Stringer from Berkeley. Thanks for jumping on right precisely on time. I'd like to think that speaks to your confidence in my ability to keep us on time, but that would be, anyway, I'll stop making jokes there because it's falling apart. So I think with that, let's transition over into the panel session. Let me go over to you've heard actually most of the folks that are here. Let me go over just quickly. Here's who we have, and Kevin, please do feel free to stay on the line as well. So Jen Stringer. So Jen, do you want to say hello? Jen is the Associate Vice Chancellor for IT and CIO at Berkeley.
I'm actually thrilled to be here, and I should say that, my tardiness does not have anything to do with how grateful and honored I am actually to be with this panel. Quite frankly, we had a bit of a chat, a pre-panel a few days ago, and all I can say is I'm incredibly impressed with the folks that are joining on this call today, and I'm looking forward to a really engaging discussion.
Great. So with that, let me see if I can get us to the proper view. Is this the right view? Can somebody confirm?
We can see you.
You can see me. Can you see our fellow panelists? I'm on speaker view. Is this the right? Did I get the right one? I didn't. All right.
Oh yeah, we're in gallery view.
Gallery view now. Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right. So I think maybe we will go through and begin again with, so at institutions or your organization, what's different under COVID? Can you provide a summary of what changed and in the way that you're delivering education and what you've done about that given the pandemic that we're all living through? And maybe we'll begin with Inger and then go to Jen and Ian.
So as Kevin said, our institution is the Peralta Community College District, which has about 19,000 students, 4 colleges in and around Oakland. And I would say that what changed the most, a brief summary. So we were already incredibly under-resourced when it came to providing technology and support and instructional design, student services in an online environment. Our district was only 17% online prior to the COVID crisis on a Friday, and on a Monday we were 100% remote teaching. So I'm sure many other people in colleges and districts dealt with the same thing, but we were incredibly already under-resourced. I would say that, as I said before, our online equity team actually was the team that jumped in because it was a fairly new team. A lot of people invested. What changed the most? As for many people, it was just a storm. We literally had 2 buildings that we called the Situation Room, and we were trying to build out. Kevin was part of our team, building resources for instructors, resources for students, and we used the Canvas LMS, and we were trying to institute LTIs. In hindsight, too many, way too fast. We weren't attending to things like FERPA and how long it would take, the burden on teachers and students to learn how to use new technologies. We have not yet had a time to do a debrief of that moment, which I think our institution could really benefit from, a team debriefing and say, what did we learn from the decisions we made? Yeah, I guess that's good. It was really hard. I'm sure it was for everybody, but it was extremely difficult.
Yeah. So let's hear it from Jen's perspective. Yeah. Thank you. Gotta unmute.
Yeah, I know. There's got to be a poem or a song that's you're on mute. You're on mute. So first of all, I think people are familiar with UC Berkeley, but just to give some quick numbers, we've got about 43, 40, maybe even 45,000 students now. So we serve a tremendously large population, the majority of whom, quite frankly, don't live, you may think that we're a residential campus, but the majority of our students do not live in our housing. And they live, you know, in the community itself, in other, and actually even outside of Berkeley proper, because Berkeley is so expensive. And we serve a tremendously diverse student body. We serve more Pell Grant students than all of the Ivy Leagues combined, just to give you a sense. I would say everything and nothing to answer your question. And by that I mean, I believe that the education that Berkeley offered students prior to COVID was at incredibly high caliber. It was offered by faculty and instructors who truly do believe in the student experience and care about student learning, and really are invested in the teaching process. And that didn't change. What changed was the delivery mechanism for that content and for those experiences. And so in that regard, everything changed. Similar to Inger, you know, we had a lot of faculty who were new to the experience of teaching online. We spun up what I would say was a tremendous effort to support them. I don't think the details are necessary because I think people can really picture what that looks like. But what I do think is important is it offered us a number of challenges to thinking about pedagogy, and I know we'll get to that in a little bit. But I actually, you know, think that we have a tremendous opportunity, even in the spring, so we had a tremendous opportunity in the spring semester to have some really amazing conversations as an institution about what it means to deliver, what does it mean to actually educate a student? And I think that those were really important. And I will just say from a technology perspective, if people are interested, I think that the transition from a technological perspective was actually quite easy. We had our virtual private network exam, and now I'm putting my IT hat on. You know, we were ready to serve the campus in remote instruction from a technical perspective. It was a major change shift from a teaching and pedagogy perspective, but it could have been it could have been much more difficult if our IT systems didn't hold up, and they actually did quite well at Berkeley. And in fact, I think it's a testament to how forward-thinking technology organizations are in many higher ed institutions, even if they're underfunded. It worked pretty darn well.
Thanks, Jen. I think it's fascinating on that point. I do want to riff on that for a sec, that it's quite striking. I think that's a striking finding for me, is how well tech held up both for educational institutions. The pieces were there and in place, and for the most part didn't break. And it's the same thing on the ed tech providers. You
Absolutely.
know, Zoom's gotten a lot slower, and not to call them out, but that could actually keep on running. It's not the same, as you said, for the pedagogy and the way it's being used, as well as the cost for providing it, I know for many has really dramatically changed as usage ramps up. So it's interesting where we've got the tech settled. So it's great that you're in the CIO role, because you're all set, right? It's like, yeah, it's all done.
Well, I will, to your point, I just will say just a quick number around Zoom, just to give people a sense. We started with 2,000 Zoom accounts on Berkeley when COVID hit and we sent people home. Within 3 weeks, we had ramped up to over 65,000 Zoom accounts. And really, again, I would say we did that pretty effortlessly. It was an effort for people to learn how to use it, but from a technical perspective, it was pretty effortless in terms of, you know, provisioning those accounts and ramping up.
Yeah. That's great. Let's go to Ian.
Yeah, so I think the question was what have we seen as different under COVID? I mean, just personally for our company, we've gone fully remote, like many have. One thing that we did kind of immediately when this started all going online and remote was we kind of fast-tracked something we've been meaning to do, which was catch up our Android platform with the iOS version and make it fully functional offline. That's super important. The number one concern that I think we saw cropping up as things started happening was accessibility, and so that was super important, and we've made sure that we have enough Android resources to be properly mobile first, because I think that's become more important comparatively. The other thing we noticed was, you know, so everyone did shift to Zoom, and let's get lectures online and let's deliver it that way. That's the fastest, easiest way we can still provide what we're providing. Very sensible decision. You know, I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit more, the sort of effects, positive and negative about that. But it's caused us to think a lot about our platform and how we can help take a Zoom lecture or a transcript or sort of video and actually try and convert it into something a little bit more bite-sized, a little bit more interactive, and how we can kind of integrate with that content. So we're used to working with publishers and instructors who are fairly digital savvy and creating their own content, either in our system or outside, and connecting it. I think suddenly a lot more of the market now has, you know, a recorded lecture or something as the starting point, and that's a new dynamic that we're kind of adapting our platform to.
Interesting to think about that as the baseline. All right, so going to Vanessa and Julie, you had said a lot, but is there anything else you wanted about what students, so we heard about what the providers are saying, what about what students are saying about the experience? Do you have more that you'd like to add than was in your presentation, or something you'd like to focus on?
Just that a lot of the major themes resonate with the literature, like instructor presence or social presence, having a connection with your students that really came up, opportunities for peer collaboration. So none of these are surprises, but they still stand, you know, these after, you know, COVID in the remote learning environment, they seem to be amplified. In fact, you know, given that everybody was online and the social distancing.
Some of the students talked about the struggle of having 5 different courses and then 5 different instructors doing different things. And so really balancing, you know, okay, everything's online and I maybe have to work more or less, but I've got 5 different ways that I was learning, as opposed to before I would show up to a class, I would do a homework, like you had these very regular patterns of these 5 courses, and then everything was different and it did not align at all. You had some students who were like, my professor uses Zoom, and I have another professor who uses Teams, and another professor that uses Blackboard Collaborate. And so trying to balance that across, you know, what was happening and just trying to keep up with something that students really struggle with. And I think they hope and expect will be better in the fall for those that will be online. So I hope that we get to see that.
Yeah, and just to add to that, you can imagine if you were enrolled in an online program, there would be a lot more cohesion in the delivery of your experience. And so if you think about these discrete courses, as Julie mentioned, you know, one instructor, all their lectures were, or 4 out of her 5 courses were at the same time of the lectures, but one wasn't, you know, and that there was a conflict there. So, and that suggests that we need some like collaboration between departments to try and get some kind of cohesion in the overall experience.
Can I just add to that really quickly? So I actually think there are 2 things going on here. One is I completely agree that one of the hardest things is to get faculty to all use the same thing. I think we know that. I think that, you know, it hits right at the heart of, in their minds anyway, academic freedom. And I think it's an important thing to attend to. However, from the analytics perspective, one of the other things that I will add is that first of all, the increase in our learning management system, which happens to be Canvas, was incredible. And the data that we're getting out of it, we actually have a data lake, and we're getting that information on a very regular basis. And so that was incredibly important. We also are getting information from some of the other tools that we have licensed or partnership agreements to get data from them to put in our data lake to feed things like an advising system that we have. But as faculty started to use additional tools, and I was watching them, you know, on their chats say, oh, try this, use this, I'm using X, Y, or Z. I kept thinking to myself, oh my gosh, we're never going to get the data out of that to understand how students were using it or whether it was even useful. So I just think, I don't have any good answers, but I will say that the excitement and plethora of tools out there makes it really difficult for those of us who actually want to utilize that data from an institutional perspective to support learning outcomes.
Yeah. And it's interesting to consider both the tools that are used and standardization around that, which often I think has been solved for core tools, but this difference of experience of, you know, what would you expect? I mean, if a student signs up for a class, they expect a certain level of kind of service, right? If they came to a classroom that was face-to-face and the teacher's like, no, I'm not coming, here's my notes, you know, here's the notes, you go read them, like that would be unacceptable. Whereas that is happening online. I have family friends that are at research institutions, not here, that have been told, you know, here's annotated, and I mentioned it in our talk, annotated PowerPoints, right? Read the PowerPoint. It's kind of like read the book and that's it. And so there's this balancing act between academic freedom, I think, Jen, as you mentioned, and like, what's our minimum commitment to students to provide them a learning experience? And, you know, is you know, live streaming a lecture, not to mention a platform, right? No matter what it's in, is that the new baseline and is that appropriate? Like, I think that's where we hope we can have some conversations around changing that. Inger, do you see the same things? I'm going to go a little out of order here, but Inger and Kevin, do you see the same things or those same concerns at community colleges as well as San Francisco State, those kind of concerns, or are they different?
You go first, Kev. Or I'll go first.
Ooh, go ahead. Go for it.
I was going to say similar. I would also, in the big picture, agree that the technology stood up. We did a student survey right before the end of spring semester, asking students what they felt they most needed to do well in, like, what their concerns were and what they most needed going forward. And overwhelmingly, students needed consistency in some type of form, consistency of what the class is, consistency of the technology, consistency where I know where I can go to find information. And so there was a real overwhelming response out of a number of different questions about that. Yeah.
Well, and to kind of pick up where some of the conversation ended with the K-12 group, if you look across, I did an analysis of about 22 different student surveys, including the Digital Promise one, which was amazing. But some of the themes that echoed across the country or individual institutions were things like students not only missed the interaction with other students and their teachers, but it had an impact on their perception of their ability to succeed. Also, just the ability to find quiet places to study. Students who may be sharing rooms may have not figured out how to barter for quiet times or make agreements with family members or roommates if they're living off campus, like Jen mentioned, happens at UC Berkeley a lot, and more. And so the different factors, like, I'm so pleased that the Digital Promise survey included 8 highly evidence-based instructional practices, and the fact that the more they were used, the higher students felt the course experience was. And so those are things, again, that raises the profile of it's not just the technology that, yes, you can move a course online very quickly by just repeating on Zoom what you normally do in a classroom, but is that better? Is that even the same? Are you creating equity issues? Like, you know, the fact that Michael Wesch at Kansas State will record himself reading all of the articles that he's assigned students to read in case they need to somehow fit that in either on public transportation or while they're washing dishes after putting the kids to bed. So like recognizing that the demographics are varied, students have a lot of priorities they're balancing, and how do they make it all work?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great transition. Thank you, Kevin and Inger, into the next question that we had, which is talking about the potential for long-term impacts on pedagogy. Many of us here have been working on implementing, you know, online learning and forms of educational technology for a long time. And I think that there's some, I think some of this transition is partly, I think we heard earlier from Roddy, is something that's exciting to kind of motivate this work. It's also terrifying in that we see some of practices we don't want to see, you know, some practices we don't want to replicate, or we don't, that is concerning. So maybe we could go Jen, Inger, Ian, hopefully that's not the same order, talking about promising practices you've seen as well as concerning practices you hope that we can avoid.
So I will focus on one and allow others to focus on particular areas. One of the spaces that I'm just incredibly actually proud of Berkeley in the stance it's taken is around remote proctoring. And I think that it has great, and I'll tell you why I think it's going to change pedagogy. We are a very large institution, and we have courses that are, you know, have enrollments of several thousand, if that gives you, I mean, it's a lot. Our introductory data science course, we actually hold it in in a venue that normally you'd see the ballet, right? Because we don't have a classroom or a lecture hall large enough. And we as a campus have been doing some interesting practices in terms of final exams and assessments. And so when we moved to remote, and that means basically proctored, lots of proctored examinations, students taking, you know, think of, you know, the fill in the bubble sheet. That's what their, you know, major grade is based on. We've got a number of majors that, you know, create very competitive environments, grading on a curve, all of the things that I think many of us would find perhaps troubling or concerning. And that came to light in a really interesting way as we started talking about remote proctoring. And our campus, for a variety of reasons, took a stand against remote proctoring because of a couple of things. One, student privacy. Most of them required a camera. Our students were sheltering in place. Many of our students were sheltering with others, whether that be their family members. There was a concern around equity about using remote proctoring services and tools, whether it was lockdown browsers or people viewing you as you were taking an exam. Huge equity issues around that. And so we actually took the stance, unlike many other institutions that were breaking the bank on remote proctoring tools and solutions, we said no. And we actually banned remote proctoring in the spring. And this fall, we are actually only allowing remote proctoring via Zoom. And it's a pilot, and you have to apply, and you have to say why you need to remote proctor, because you can't, what other assessment methods have you looked at before you decided that this was the only way to assess student learning. And, you know, we have less than 75 requests to participate in our remote proctoring study or pilot in the fall. What that means is, and we have probably 4,000 to 6,000 lecture-based courses.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah,
So it is incredible to me. And I think, and we are talking about the honor code, like we had never talked about the honor code prior. And senior leadership is incredibly invested in this. And it really is, it's about equity, and it's about authentic assessment, and it's really about measuring learning. We would not have had those kinds of conversations, honestly, if it hadn't have been for that. So I just picked one example that to me is incredibly impactful from a campus perspective. And I believe that regardless of when we come back to campus for in-person learning, it will change the way we assess students forever. That's my hope anyway.
Yeah, nice, thank you, Jen.
I would say that we did not have the fortitude to ban proctoring. Jen, we talked about this, but we simply didn't purchase the proctoring software for faculty as a way to do it. So I just wanted to say, yay, UCB, Peralta's not far behind. So the potential, I would say, for long-term impacts is on pedagogy is simply a shift towards even thinking about pedagogy, because the requirement to take the talking in a classroom into a technological device requires instructors to think about outcomes. Even many teachers didn't really think about outcomes, they just had things to tell. So really sort of shifting to outcome, and then thinking of universal design. How can I reach students with this information? How can I invite them to the information? And how can I give them multiple opportunities to engage it? So there's that. And then, as I said, the equity team was kind of the core of instructional design. So the one good thing about the crisis that happened in March was that a lot of instructors came to us, and when we said we'll help you, we said we'll help you with a focus and centering of equity through your pedagogy and instructional design. So that was good, and remains promising, because that is true as we go into prepare for fall also. The one concerning practice is folks who, for whatever reason, just don't have the bandwidth, fortitude, or interest. A shift to the please read the please read the PowerPoint and then submit a homework assignment. And essentially, I mean, for all the reasons that's horrific for students, it actually also is correspondence teaching, and brings other risks to the institution and things like that. So
that's an interesting observation. Yeah, because you don't have the effective time, the regular effective time.
Yeah, so on positive and negative impacts on pedagogy, I definitely echo and just react to what Jan and Ingo were talking about with remote proctoring. It's really heartening to hear how seriously you're taking that and thinking about how we can assess things in a more intelligent way. It's sort of horrifying to me to imagine that we try and shoehorn exams with all their limitations and things into this kind of environment with all the extra limitations you're going to have with it. It feels like, as I've talked about, a great opportunity to kind of move beyond that, use things that are a bit more scientifically valid, or just a bit more thoughtful. I've seen a lot of things on Twitter from people I've been following, instructors sharing ideas for different tasks and ways of assessing people and things they can do instead of quizzes and assessments and tests. And it's been really interesting. So I'm very hopeful on that side of things. On the less hopeful or the harder challenges that I see coming down the line, definitely it's less clear to me what people are going to replace the sort of hour-long lecture with. So hour-long lectures are very similar to exams, I think, in that there's a lot of inertia behind them, and they exist for mostly practical reasons, right? If you're teaching in person and everyone's traveling to a location, you might as well make good use of that time. And so we have this sort of relatively long period of time that we talk for. It's a very inefficient way to learn, as we know. It's difficult if that's all kind of one-way dump of information. That's still, I think, the way a lot of people are approaching teaching right now by necessity. But that's something that I think obviously we have to find some different ways to impart that information and keep engaging. And the big red warning lights for me are the ones on student engagement and how challenging it's going to be to motivate people, especially given how much that seems to track demographics and existing inequality.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Sure. All right, and maybe go speaking about these changes in pedagogy. I think it's kind of a similar question. Actually, maybe we'll thinking about the changes are impacting inequities. So can you speak to this? And maybe we'll begin what we've seen through the change happening with online learning, as well as the changes to pedagogy impacting students from minoritized backgrounds. So if we think about that, if we begin with Inger, then maybe Vanessa and Julie.
And I actually might ask Kevin to speak to some data he pulled about what happened in our institution in the spring. But I would say that it has, I fear we only have, preliminary data, and spring was a very unusual semester because of, it was unexpected in this shift to remote teaching. We know that overall moving education online exacerbates education debt and disproportionately, even more so, impacts minoritized students from minoritized backgrounds. I fear the COVID crisis in time and in hindsight, data is going to show that that became even worse because of the shift, the rapid shift to remote learning and online. I'm not sure about that, but I'm suspicious. And I think that what we're trying to do is to just really focus on the rubric and the kinds of activities, almost mainstreaming the kinds of activities that the literature says work and make a difference. Yeah. For students. Yeah. It's just sort of like go all in on those things and then run some research as we're doing to say that, image and representation matters to students. It might not matter to some people and teachers, but it does to students, how content is presented, how people are represented, and not just imagery, but true representation, right, in all of its meanings. And that students connecting with other students matter, and that students connecting to the course content and their own lived experience being connected to that content, it does matter to them. So I would say we're just sort of going all in with what we know to be true and working research and trying to find, create data that tests it and see what happens.
Going all in with what we know to be true. I think we're gonna write that in the chat. That's a great statement to go by. Yeah, Kevin, did you want to add to that from some of the data that Inger mentioned?
Only that and this is something we found talking to another community college in the system, and they found the same thing happened, but those courses that began spring 2020 as online courses, the student success rates continued to improve compared to previous semesters and academic years. But the traditional face-to-face courses in spring 2020, across the board, student success rates went down. And so that was possibly, there are a number of variables that could account for that, but obviously the switch to emergency remote teaching and learning, especially for students who did not choose to be in online courses and faculty members who did not choose to teach them, are just two of the variables that could take place. But Ian's talked about some, Julie and Vanessa talked about some, Jen talked about some, Inger talked about, everybody is aware of the different things that could take place. But the fact that students in courses that began the semester online, and this is across all the demographics that we showed in those different charts, they continue to increase their student success rates despite the troubled time.
That's interesting. Huh.
Can I also say one other thing, John? I'm really looking forward to all the community colleges, and this may be relevant particularly also to some of the tech companies that design ed tech. The California community college system gave students an opportunity for a late withdrawal that never existed before. And we're really looking to see what is that data, because what that data will tell us about who opted for that and with a waiver of fee. So that we were already past that in the semester, right? Most community colleges were, but we're looking to see when we get a chunk of that data about who chose that option and seeing if there's any information in that would be helpful.
Mm.
Can I just, Inga, that's really interesting. One of the things that Berkeley did and a number of other, I think, four-year universities, especially sort of in the R1 category, is move to pass, no pass as default, or in some cases only. So that was a big conversation at Berkeley in terms of we actually switched our entire student information system and swapped students, and all of our courses were pass, no pass, and students had to go in and actually make the active choice to take a grade instead of that. for a variety of reasons, in some of our disciplines, students were very anxious about the idea of what that would mean for their future careers and you know, getting into grad school or going to med school or going to law school. But it would be very interesting data, and a number of campuses did that. Did the community colleges do that as well?
No, there was a way to elect a pass, no pass option, but that was limited. What was offered universally across the entire institution, across the state, was essentially the addition of a late withdrawal. It's the same kind of thing that had happened, but they had just basically said, and they actually have given them that option all the way through spring of 21. So they can continue in fall and spring and still go back and elect that choice after. So, yeah.
Yep, yep. Oh, there's a great question in the chat around the downstream effect of the choice. Thank you.
Great. All right, Vanessa and Julie.
Just a couple things to add, and it's sort of building on what Kelly was saying about, you know, the presentation of content, and what Kevin was saying about, you know, that instructors recorded articles so students could read them or listen to them on the bus. You know, one instructor, I call it a success story because students just were they talked a lot about their other courses and how bad they were in comparison, you know, so they were sort of holding this course at the benchmark. And I will add that this instructor was using courseware and they were, you know, tech savvy, like, you know, to be clear. But what she did is she took her typical 40-minute lectures and she broke them up into like 8 smaller chunks. And the students really appreciated this for a number of reasons. One, they could listen, you know, to 1 or 2 sections in its entirety, and they wouldn't sort of miss that sort of continuity if they have to come back later. And another student had a hearing disability, and she said, you know, I really appreciate that it's shorter and I can go back and rewind, because this was something I couldn't do in class. I was always a person, you know, asking the instructor to repeat themselves. So I think, you know, this notion of making content more digestible, you know, for an online environment, so it can be consumed in different modalities, and also, you know, making some content print related that you can download, you know, read it offline, you know, similar like listening to something, you know, on audio. Just different ways that students can access the material and engage with it, I think would help with equity.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's been work done from I was forgetting the foundation now, getting a little bit tired. The course redesign, Carol Twig's course redesign project, which happened, you know, forever ago, it seems like, did a study, and it was exactly what you mentioned, Vanessa, is one of the things. They did a study of course redesign for students from, you know, minoritized communities. And that's one of the things that they found, was that the ability to replay, to rewind, to rewatch is something that they really appreciated the opportunity to do, because you don't have the social stigma associated with asking the teacher to say something again if you don't understand the language or the words. It also serves, right, the other side of the students who want to hit fast forward, and like I do that on Coursera, let's go to 2 times, right? Let's go to 2.5. Wait, no, I can't understand the word. You can do it either way.
And just to add to that, many students commented that they didn't want to burden their professors and send them an email. It was invasive. And certainly, you know, I can understand that, you know, having to send an instructor, you know, just an email, you know, about your problem amplifies it in a sense. So in that way, I think community forums or, you know, different ways of engaging and offering help would be appreciated.
Yeah. And those differences about what people feel like with their instructors vary heavily by the student background. Yeah. All right. So this one I want to add. So we'll move on to the next question. So I want to ask this, Jen, you referred to this a little bit, but what R&D opportunities, I put and so research opportunities and the unanswered questions are being created by this COVID either emergency or more planful transition, and who do you think is best positioned to answer them?
I'll approach it in a couple of different ways. One is just the amount of data that we have right now. This is just completely unprecedented in terms of the switch to online. So I think our use of Canvas went up. I'm not kidding you, it's like 3,000% in the spring in terms of the number of minutes and page views and that kind of thing that were going on. It's just incredible. An incredible amount of data, in third-party tools. So I think there's some opportunities really to show, and I have to say, as people who really care about activity data and we know that it's not just about the LMS. We know it's about whether they're using Piazza or whether they're using, third-party tools to annotate textbooks. Actually, the textbook publishers right now hold so much information that we don't have access to as people who are studying how students, interact with content, learning content online. So I just think there's a plethora of data out there, and wading through it and trying to figure out what are the most useful pieces are going to be, we need a lot of data analysts. We need people who understand how to make meaning from the data, and a lot of it is unstructured or semi-structured in terms of what we would want to take a look at, right? It's log file data. And that's what the beauty of a data lake or IMS standards are, to help us make some sense of it. But the majority of the tools that are being used don't adhere to any of those standards. So I think there's a huge opportunity there. I also think that we have to be careful, and this is an aha moment for me. I have a student advisory group that normally just advises me on things like why the Wi-Fi isn't working and that kind of stuff. And we had some incredibly impactful conversations with them about what it meant to live in a life of COVID and doing remote instruction. And I think we all know that it's having an incredible, mental health impact on many, many, many people, maybe including some of us as we're trying to shelter in place, but definitely students. And they're reporting greater depression and anxiety. And so as we're looking at this data, I think we have to remind ourselves that there's a lens that we need to look at it through, and that is a tremendous upheaval lens and tremendous disruption. And what we see in this data may not necessarily, there may be some bias in the data itself because of how, the context through which it was generated, which is an incredible societal upheaval in a way that I don't think most of our students, any of our students probably, have experienced before. So that to me is a really interesting lens for people who look at it not from a learning impact lens, but also just from a social science lens as to what it means to undergo such a disruptive change in anything, including a disruptive change in education.
Yeah, I think addressing it with that question in mind, that you're trying to understand a disruptive period and to look at this as if this is not everything as usual. And I think we've heard that in all the presentations today, is to look at this, trying to understand what are the differences that have taken place? Like, what are the differences in audience, the difference in platform use, those kind of things. I'll say I have seen very little that, and there's bias, but I think that it's not bias. I think in the bias you mean is that don't assume that everything is status quo and that the models you've created in the past apply to the future, right?
Exactly. And you can't necessarily, when you're comparing this data to other data in, online, it's not the same. And so I just think we need to remind ourselves of that, because I think we've already created a new normal and we forget that sometimes, that this is not normal.
Let's not, we don't want to normalize this.
I was going to say, I hope it's not.
I hope it's not normal. And also sort of speaking to that, this disruption, right? So if we can't compare it to what has happened in the past, how do we compare between instances? And so sort of that R&D focus of what are we going to study? We heard lots of people do things in the name of equity, right? So they said, I'm going to, you know, upload recorded videos for equity so that my students can watch them whenever. Or we're going to hand out 10,000 laptops, and that's in the name of equity so that everyone has a device. We heard institutions go from the range of there will be no proctored exams to we're going to pay for proctored exams so students don't have to do it, versus students will have no timed exams. And like all of these things were done in the name of equity, which all came from a really good place. And I know that they were, but I'm interested in what worked, right? Like which of these things were actually equitable in terms of student access and success?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that.
You're welcome.
Yeah. And I do have to, you know, plug, I think, the work that Kevin and Inger have been working on to identify some of those promising practices that have been done, but you know, we need the evidence around them, right? We need more evidence. We need more of that data around them. Yeah.
Somebody asked a question in the chat about security and privacy.
Yeah.
And actually, I was also going to hope that Ian had some thoughts about this as well. My guess is you probably do. Many of you do also, I'm sure. But I do think that, you know, this is a huge shift, and I think it's causing us to have difficult conversations, like I said, about the remote proctoring in terms of just student privacy and equity, but also in terms of the systems that we're using and the fact that there are new shiny tools out there. And I think, you know, as faculty are looking to find the right tool to help an online environment or their online learning experience for their students, we have to remember that many of those tools that are offered for free are collecting data about our students and faculty practices, quite frankly, in a way that we would probably, if we were an institution, would want to have some agreements with those vendors or those, you know, service providers about what they were doing with that data, how they are using it. And so I do, right, exactly. If you're not buying the product, you are the product. And it's so true. And it's really hard to have those conversations with faculty when they're honestly looking for something to improve the learning experience, especially in distress. But I think that that's also a time that we need to be even more ever present as people, as the stewards. You know, I think of myself as a steward, actually, of a lot of student information and data, and we really need to be thoughtful about that. And in fact, I will say we fought very hard in ensuring that we were including in faculty guidance information about third-party tools, about what they needed to do, that they shouldn't be signing click-through agreements. It sounds very legalese, but you know, you're signing on behalf of the institution when you do that. Are you requiring students to purchase something? Are you in some ways coercing students to give their data to a third-party, you know, a third party that may be selling it somewhere else, and students have no choice? All these things that I think a lot of us have been worried about for a long time, but they've been sort of marginal cases. And maybe we've been seen as the crazy people standing on the soapbox, you know, yelling about our concerns and people not really listening. They're very serious concerns now. And I think that it's an opportunity for us to educate senior leadership, especially on our campuses, and senior academic leadership about what these things mean and how we as an institution can ensure that we're really protecting our students and our faculty in the right way.
I agree. I want to weigh in on that one. And it's an interesting kind of balance where I've worked with other institutions saying, you can't use our data for anything, which I think really disadvantages the institution, because if, you know, Berkeley students' data cannot be looked at by, you know, choose your application to see if it's meeting the needs it was intended for, if it's validating the use cases, if it's working or not, which many people people here are trying to do. They don't want to sell it. They just want to try to see what it can be used for, and the kind of to do analytics against it. It is, I think, shooting it yourself in the foot. I'm gonna be that kind of finger waggy person, I kind of feel like, you know, but it is important to see that, because I've had institutions say, no, you can't look at your data. And to me, it's like telling a doctor or somebody who, you know, provides medical care, say, no, you can't look at my charts because they're mine. It's like, okay, well, you know, that really disadvantages. But on the other side, you do see ed tech platforms and providers are now monetizing data, either selling it or saying, hey, we're collecting all this data, and if you buy us, you buy this data, which I think is wrong. I mean, I'll just straightforward say that it's wrong. And so there's a need for a conversation that doesn't, you know, enable something, but is kind of threads the needle in an important way. It's a tricky one, I think, in those conversations, because the people that want to talk about it the most are often the ones that are really far on, you know,
one side or the other.
Yep. Yeah, it's very polarized.
And I also think that it's sort of like the horse is out of the barn in some places and in some issues, and it's just like working really hard to sort of stop the flow and shut it down. And Jen, I see you just shared some principles from Berkeley, and I appreciate that, because that's super helpful. You guys are out in front. That's really great.
Sure.
Yeah, that was adopted by all of the University of California in like 2017, 2018. But to you, I just want to, John, I think you're right on there. I think one of the key things from an institutional perspective, when you look at the vendor space, we want that data to ensure that we're actually delivering quality education and supporting our students. So I don't know that it's so much that you can't have it to the vendors, or at least the way I think of it, but I want it, and I want it in a consumable way, and I want it in a way that is close to real time, or in standard formats that I can then analyze against other tools. And we all know this. I mean, many of us, but it may be new for some people to hear that that it is a really difficult. If you're trying to look at data across providers, or even get data, especially from those tools that faculty are, signing a click-through agreement, those providers assume that data is their cash cow, and they're not going to share it back to the institution unless you really work hard to negotiate with them.
Yeah, and we need to make that's just not okay. All right, maybe we should look toward wrapping up. Maybe one more question. So again, the final kind of recommendation to this community is, Baylan, what can we do? What should we do to be most relevant to the current situation, and as we emerge into not the new normal, but this more planful stage of the pandemic? And Ian, we haven't heard from you for a little bit, so maybe I'll pick on you. We can start with you, and then maybe go Vanessa and Julie, Inger, Kevin, and Jen, just to try to put an order there so we don't step on each other.
Great, thanks, John. I'd love to actually just bounce off that last point as well that was made. I think it's a super interesting question to bring up data security, data privacy, where that data lives and how it's linked together in the context of what we were just talking about before, which is we have all these unanswered questions that we really, really want to answer, that are urgent to answer in order to make sure we're actually providing value and helping people learn and making sure that these things are equitable. And it's interesting from our point of view as a small tech company. We are a B2B organization, which means we don't sell direct to consumers. We don't store user data other than kind of learning data. Most of our data is anonymized anyway. That's sort of not part of our value proposition anyway. So that in some ways makes it easier for us to just say, well, we don't store any demographics or anything like that. That's fine. But it makes it harder to then answer some of these questions. So some of the data I've shown you, I'd love to be able to split that up by different demographics, but we just don't have that data. We don't even have access to, the outcomes, the real world outcomes we care about, unless we partner with somebody to get that. And so, generally what we'll do is we'll throw the data over a wall, so to speak. We'll kind of anonymize it, but link it to something that the institution can link it, and then they'll go and link all the rest of the data together, anonymize it, and shuffle things around, send it back for us to analyze. And that works. But it was striking hearing you talk, Jen, about UCB and the data lake that you have and the real appetite for that granularity data. And it strikes me that the place where that data should be and the people who should be sort of controlling it, you know, sharing it out to analyze as and when it's needed, should probably be the educational institutions. I think it's just, there's a better alignment of incentives there with the students, there's a better understanding of those subtleties of like the value of the data versus the need for privacy and what the regulations are even around it, like compared to what, to the best of our intentions, a startup could do. So I think that's one of the things that we could be thinking about doing, is making sure that we start to gather that data, as you say, in a consistent way, in the right place, in those kind of organizations who can then sort of manage it, share it, and start answering some of these questions. I think that's so important.
Great. Thank you, Ian.
Who did you name next? Okay.
I'll just skip Vanessa because my point is, if you are not in a situation like Ian and you can disaggregate the data, you should. And then my main take-home message of things to look for in the future is consider intersectional identities, because these are all things that you can't just look at things by race and ethnicity or by gender or by income. And all these things play together to student identities, and we're very much in the numbers and the log data and all these things that we really care about, but there's a story there. And so understanding that student story, and then just doing what you can to, you know, to make learning better. Cause like, that's what we're all here for. Like, I'm amazed at some of the institutions and all the work they did, especially people on this panel. And so just like, keep doing good work.
I'd love to just emphasize that point that Julie made about the demographic data that we have available and the way it's split up. It's very tempting to just look at patterns amongst those things. But I mean, as I sort of pointed out earlier, one of the kind of hidden variables we see with exams is that people who have chronic test anxiety, but you don't measure that on a form. That's not data that's readily available. It's something very real and very human that a lot of people deal with that would be useful to know and understand. There's a ton of different things like that. So being open-minded about the people behind it, not reducing them to these standard sets of statistics is so crucial. I totally agree, Julie.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry, just to chime in, and sorry, it was one of those moments like when your trackpad stops working and you have to like repair. So I was a little stuck there. Anyway, yeah, just the human face behind the data. We're trying to do qualitative data in more systematic, meaningful ways. And just to build on that point about test anxiety, many students are anxious about taking their tests online, all of them, especially those that don't have internet connections. Instructors that gave their students options, okay, you know, you could throw your lowest test score away. You know, they don't want to waste that on the time when their internet went down. You know, they want to be able to make that decision for themselves. So, but just a shout out to everyone again for the great work you and we're all doing.
Thank you, Vanessa. Yeah.
Am I next?
Yeah.
So I would say, what can we do? One is to always seek for the opportunities to collect qualitative data to go with the quantitative data, because the quantitative data only goes so far to tell you. And kind of to build on both what Julie and I think Ian said is that when we look at student demographics, and there are large-scale institutional inequalities in our society, and they still carve up society in really unequal ways. And I believe we really need to be tender and careful about the way we pull those demographic data and actually improve it, and then also be sensitive about how that data historically has often been used as part of a system of inequality, and to reify inequalities in our society. And Julie, I'm really glad you said the intersectionality, because one of the things that drives us crazy is right now we can only sort of group students by, say, their self-identified racial ethnic groups, and even those groups are very limited, the titles of them and how people experience them, the gender, right, things like that. So even beginning to expand how we understand how we group different students but always also remembering that those, you know, that those things reflect inequalities, and that, sort of like you said, Jen, we have to be the stewards of how data is used to do what education is supposed to do, which is fundamentally an opportunity to break down some of those inequalities.
Great. Thank you, Inger.
I think I was supposed to follow Inger. And so I'm just going to make 3 quick points. One, I put it in the chat, but along these lines of what we're talking about, there's someone out of Macomb Community College in the Detroit area. His name's Chris Gilliard. He's been talking about digital redlining. He's put together some great articles on EDUCAUSE review, and he's got a website, hypervisible.com. But along the same lines of what Inger just said, how are we collecting and analyzing data, and are we doing it in ways that might be perpetuating the challenges that we're hoping to solve? Next, who is defining success? So I was lucky to moderate a student panel keynote session for the online teaching conference in 2019. And one of the students said, hey, I'm a 35-year-old single mother who works full time, and my goal is just to get by enough to succeed in getting my goal of higher pay bracket with a credential or what have you. So she may not trigger all of the things that we think success entails, but she has defined success differently. Similarly, career and technical education instructors say that students will enroll in their courses in order to prepare for a certification exam. They'll take that certification exam halfway through a semester and then stop taking the class because they have reached their goal of passing that certification exam, not to get an A or even pass the the class that they're in. And last but not least, a group I'm with created a task force, and over the last year, it has been working on digital ethics issues. And I'm pasting in the chat right now a link to a set of principles that we generated related to things that instructors can do, campuses can do, students can do, platform providers can do. And this is only a third to half of the number of principles we wanted to create, but it was such a vast effort that we wanted to do it right. But these principles are followed by scenarios and what do you call it? Strategies, tools. So it's a deep link thing. If you're not seeing the link, it's there again. Thanks, Ruchi, for passing that along.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. All right, Jen.
Yeah, so, you know, I concur with everything that's been said, so I'll touch on a couple of slightly different points. One is, I think, as we're talking about our students and we're talking about our responsibility to them, part of our responsibility is to remember that in higher education, our students are adults and they have autonomy, and we should be transparent with them about what we're doing with their information and their data as well. So just thinking about how that plays into research questions, and you know, what is our responsibility to our students to let them know what we're utilizing the data for. And I think especially because we have so much of it now, and especially because of the huge switch to remote learning, we have a lot more information about a lot more students. And I just think we need to think carefully about how we enable them to have autonomy or at least agency over a lot of the data that we're collecting about them. And way back when we had at Berkeley played around with this idea of a student agency dashboard, so that they could actually see what data was being collected and opt in and out of various studies. And it was a prototype, and we didn't end up putting it forward into production, but it's still something that stays with me. The other thing in terms of things to think about, especially those of us who are in institutions and are stewards of this kind of information, is remembering to partner with researchers and thinking about the data in a way that enables research activity. And I will say that Zach Pardos, who is a faculty member at UC Berkeley, has been a wonderful partner with us. And one of the things that we've worked to do is to try to provide him with anonymized data for his research studies. And honestly, I will say that takes effort and investment in the part of us as a service provider or an IT provider or whatever you want to say. You know, that's work that we're doing to enable research. And I just think that if you think about that from the outset, we really become a valuable provider of information to continue to you know, provide researchers with information that they can then give back to us in a way that enables us to actually do a better job at providing you know, services to faculty and students. So
great. Thank you, Jen. I think there's an interesting, so with that, I think there's an interesting kind of follow-on conversation to that around partnering with ed tech institutions in forming those kind of partnerships, because just as you said that, what I wanted to say previously, but it felt a little disingenuous, what it felt like actually, is to say, you know, it takes resources and funding and research investments for ed tech institutions as well to develop that, right? So to develop and to develop those resources and to make that data available and to disaggregate it. And in many cases, institutions, you know, they have a fixed set of resources and choice that they can work with. So they have to choose between providing data and then providing more features that people want. And frankly, more often, right, they'll pay for the features, but they're not paying for the data about whether or not, or the analysis, right? Because now we're often getting the analysis, right? So that there's some, I think there's some interesting ongoing kind of conversations to have. It would be great to, maybe we do as a follow-on to Baylan, especially with the demand and need for data analysis in the face of COVID and emergency onlining. So it's something maybe that we could continue and think about. I think it's a really big issue. So with that, I want to thank you all. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time out of your busy schedules and work schedules and family life to make this happen, and for the work that you're doing. For people that are not on the panel and participating, those of you that stayed on, we really appreciate it. Thank you for your time as well. I want to, can I hand it back over to Leanne? Are you here to represent Baylan and formally close us off? We've got a couple minutes, and then the monkey comes out with the thing, or I think we're gonna.
I can do it. John, thank you so much. I think on behalf of Baylan and everyone who has participated today, I think we want to extend a big thank you to John for being the moderator of this session for a whole 4 hours long. I'm not sure we had anticipated beforehand how long that actually is. So thank you so much for doing that. In a regular in-person meeting, we would have given you a present, but maybe we can, you know, send something your way.
The bill's in the mail, no worries.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much to our panelists. I think we discussed a ton of super interesting issues today, and everything is recorded, so it might actually be a valuable resource for people who, you know, couldn't make it today. So yeah, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to John, and also thank you to all the Baylan people who have been working behind the scenes, collecting questions from the chat and trying to moderate this discussion. And yeah, I agree with Anita. Thank you to Leanne, who has been here.
All the
different formats. Thank you, all the Leannes, for being here. And yeah, we really hope to see you at our next Baylan event. I don't know where we're going to be able to meet in person, but let's hope we can. And otherwise, we'll try to make sure to have something for you guys.
Thank you, Justine. Thanks, everyone.